Section 1 of The Golden Bough, The Magic Art and the Evolution of Kings, Volume 2, Chapter 8, Departmental Kings of Nature. The preceding investigation has proved that the same union of sacred functions with the royal title which meets us in the King of the Wood at Nemi, the sacrificial king of Rome, and the magistrate called the king at Athens, occurs frequently outside the limits of classical antiquity and is a common feature of societies at all stages from barbarism to civilization. Further, it appears that the royal priest is often a king, not only in name but in fact, swaying the scepter as well as the crozier. All this confirms the traditional view of the origin of the titular and priestly kings in the republics of ancient Greece and Italy, at least by showing that the combination of spiritual and temporal power of which Greco-Italian tradition preserved the memory has actually existed in many places. We have obviated any suspicion of improbability that might have attached to the tradition. Therefore we may now fairly ask, may not the King of the Wood have had an origin like that which our probable tradition assigns to the sacrificial king of Rome and the titular king of Athens? In other words, may not his predecessors in office have been a line of kings whom a Republican revolution stripped of their political power, leaving them only their religious functions and the shadow of a crown? There are at least two reasons for answering this question in the negative. One reason is drawn from the abode of the priest of Nemi, the other from his title, the King of the Wood. If his predecessors had been kings in the ordinary sense, he would surely have been found residing, like the fallen kings of Rome and Athens, in a city of which the scepter had passed from him. This city must have been Aricia, for there is none nearer. But Aricia was 3 miles off from his forest sanctuary by the lake shore. If he reigned, it was not in the city but in the greenwood. Again, his title, King of the Wood, hardly allows us to suppose that he had ever been a king in the common sense of the word. More likely he was a king of nature, and of a special side of nature, namely the woods from which he took his title. If we could find instances of what we may call departmental kings of nature, this is, of persons supposed to rule over particular elements or aspects of nature, they would probably present a closer analogy to the King of the Wood and the divine kings we have been hitherto considering, whose control of nature is general rather than special. Instances of such departmental kings are not wanting. Kings of Rain in Africa. On a hill at Boma, near the mouth of the Congo, dwells Namvuluvumu, king of the rain and storm. Of some of the tribes of the Upper Nile, we are told that they have no kings in the common sense. The only persons whom they acknowledge as such are the kings of the rain, Matakodu, who are credited with the power of giving rain at the proper time, that is, in the rainy season. Before the rains begin to fall at the end of March, the country is a parched and arid desert, and the cattle, which form the people's chief wealth, perish for lack of grass. So when the end of March draws on, each householder betakes himself to the king of the rain and offers him a cow that he may make the blessed waters of heaven to drip on the brown and withered pastures. If no shower falls, the people assemble and demand that the king shall give them rain, and if the sky still continues cloudless, they rip up his belly, in which he is believed to keep the storms. Among the Bari tribe, one of these rain kings made rain by sprinkling water on the ground out of a handbell. Priesthood of the Alfei. Among tribes on the outskirts of Abyssinia, a similar office exists, as being thus described by an observer. The priesthood of the Alfei, as he is called by the Baria of Kanoma, is a remarkable one. He is believed to be able to make rain. This office formerly existed among the Algeds and appears to be still common to the Nuba Negroes. The Alfei of the Baria, who is also consulted by the northern Kunama, lives near Tembadir, on a mountain alone with his family. The people bring him tribute in the form of clothes and fruits, and cultivate for him a large field of his own. He is a kind of king, and his office passes by inheritance to his brother or sister's son. He is supposed to conjure down rain and to drive away the locusts, but if he disappoints the people's expectation and a great drought arises in the land, the Alfei is stoned to death, and his nearest relations are obliged to cast the first stone at him. When we passed through the country, the office of Alfei was still held by an old man, but I heard that rain-making had proved too dangerous for him, and that he had renounced his office. Kings of Fire and Water in Cambodia. In the backwoods of Cambodia live two mysterious sovereigns known as the King of the Fire and the King of the Water. Their fame is spread all over the south of the great Indo-Chinese peninsula, but only a faint echo of it has reached the west. Down to a few years ago, no European, so far as is known, had ever seen either of them, and their very existence might have passed for a fable, were it not till lately communications were regularly maintained between them and the King of Cambodia, who year by year exchanged presents with them. The Cambodian gifts were passed from tribe to tribe till they reached their destination, for no Cambodian would essay the long and perilous journey. The tribe amongst whom the kings of fire and water reside is the Cherais, or Jere, a race with European features but a sallow complexion, inhabiting the forest-clad mountains and high tablelands which separate Cambodia from Amman. Their royal functions are of a purely mystical or spiritual order. They have no political authority. They are simple peasants, living by the sweat of their brow and the offerings of the faithful. According to one account, they live in absolute solitude, never meeting each other and never seeing a human face. They inhabit successively 7 towers perched upon 7 mountains, and every year they pass from one tower to another. People come furtively and cast within their reach what is needful for their subsistence. The kingship lasts 7 years, the time necessary to inhabit all the towers successfully, but many die before their time is out. The officers are hereditary in one, or, according to others, 2 royal families who enjoy high consideration, have revenues assigned to them, and are exempt from the necessity of tilling the ground. But naturally the dignity is not coveted, and when a vacancy occurs, all eligible men, they must be strong and have children, flee and hide themselves. Another account admitting the reluctance of the hereditary candidates to accept the crown does not countenance the report of their hermit-like seclusion in the 7 towers, for it represents the people as prostrating themselves before the mystic kings whenever they appear in public, having thought that a terrible hurricane would burst over the country if this mark of homage were omitted. Probably, however, these are mere fables such as commonly shed a glamour of romance over the distant and unknown. A French officer who had an interview with the redoubtable Fire King in February 1891 found him stretched on a bamboo couch, diligently smoking a long copper pipe, and surrounded by people who paid him no great deference. In spite of his mystic vocation, the sorcerer had no charm or talisman about him, and was in no way distinguishable from his foes except by his tall stature. Another writer reports that the 2 kings are much feared, because they are supposed to possess the evil eye, hence everyone avoids them, and the potentates considerately cough to announce their approach, and to allow people to get out of the way. They enjoy extraordinary privileges and immunities, but their authority does not extend beyond the few villages of their neighbourhood. Like many other sacred kings of whom we shall read in the sequel, the kings of fire and water are not allowed to die a natural death, for that would lower their reputation. Accordingly, when one of them is seriously ill, the elders order consultation. If they think he cannot recover, they stab him to death. His body is burned and the ashes are piously collected and publicly honoured for 5 years. Part of them is given to the widow, as she keeps them in an urn, which she must carry on her back when she goes to weep on her husband's grave. Supernatural powers of the kings of fire and water. We are told that the Fire King, the more important of the 2, whose supernatural powers have never been questioned, officiates at marriages, festivals, and sacrifices in honour of the Yan or spirit. On these occasions, a special place is set apart for him, and the path by which he approaches is spread with white cotton cloths. A reason for confining the royal dignity to the same family is that this family is in possession of certain famous talismans which would lose their virtue or disappear if they passed out of the family. These talismans are 3. The fruit of a creeper called kui, gathered ages ago at the time of the last deluge, but still fresh and green. A rattan, also very old, but bearing flowers that never fade. And lastly, a sword containing a yan or spirit, guards it constantly and works miracles with it. The spirit is said to be that of a slave whose blood chanced to fall upon the blade while it was being forged, and who died a voluntary death to expiate his involuntary offence. By means of the 2 former talismans, the Water King can raise a flood that would drown the whole earth. If the Fire King draws a magic sword a few inches from its sheath, the sun is hidden and men and beasts fall into a profound sleep. Were he to draw it quite out of the scabbard, the world would come to an end. To this wondrous band, sacrifices of buffaloes, pigs, fowls, and ducks are offered for rain. It is kept swathed in cotton and silk, and amongst the annual presents sent by the King of Cambodia were rich stuffs to wrap the sacred sword. Gifts sent by the kings of fire and water to the King of Cambodia. In return, the kings of fire and water sent him a huge wax candle and 2 calabashes, one full of rice and the other of sesame. The candle bore the impress of the Fire King's middle finger, and was probably thought to contain the seed of fire, which the Cambodian monarch thus received once a year fresh from the Fire King himself. This holy candle was kept for sacred uses. On reaching the capital of Cambodia, it was entrusted to the Brahmins, who laid it up beside the regalia, and with the wax made tapers, which were burned on the altars on solemn days. As the candle was a special gift of the Fire King, we may conjecture that the rice and sesame were the special gifts of the Water King. The latter was doubtless king of rain as well as of water, and the fruits of the earth were boons conferred by him on men. In times of calamity as during plague, floods, and war, a little of this sacred rice and sesame was scattered on the ground to appease the wrath of the maleficent spirits. Contrary to the common usage of the country, which is to bury the dead, the bodies of both these mystic monarchs are burnt, but their nails and some of their teeth and bones are religiously preserved as amulets. It is while the corpse is being consumed on the pyre that the kinsmen of the deceased magician flee to the forest and hide themselves for fear of being elevated to the invidious dignity which he has just vacated. The people go in search for them, and the first whose lurking place they discover is made king of fire or water. These then are examples of what I have called departmental kings of nature, but it is a far cry to Italy from the forests of Cambodia and the sources of the Nile. And though kings of rain, water and fire have been found, we have still to discover a king of the wood to match the Arisian priest who bore that title. Perhaps we shall find him nearer home. End of Chapter 8. Section 2, Chapter 9, The Worship of Trees. 1. Tree Spirits. Great Forests of Ancient Europe. In the religious history of the Aryan race in Europe, the worship of trees has played an important part. Nothing could be more natural, for at the dawn of history, Europe was covered with immense primeval forests in which the scattered clearings must have appeared like islets in the ocean of green. Down to the 1st century before our era, the Hercynian forest stretched eastward from the Rhine for a distance at once vast and unknown. Germans who Caesar questioned had travelled for 2 months through it without reaching the end. 4 centuries later it was visited by the Emperor Julian, and the solitude, the gloom, the silence of the forest appeared to have made a deep impression on his sensitive nature. He declared that he knew nothing like it in the Roman Empire. In our own country, the wealds of Kent, Surrey and Sussex are remnants of the great forest Van der Ridder, which once clove the whole of the southeastern portion of the island. Westward it seems to have stretched till it joined another forest that extended from Hampshire to Devon. In the reign of Henry II, the citizens of London still hunted the wild bull and the boar in the woods of Hampstead. Even under later Plantagenets, the royal forests were 68 in number. In the forest of Arden it was said that down to modern times a squirrel might leap from tree to tree for nearly a whole length of Warwickshire. The excavation of ancient pile villages in the valley of the Po has shown that long before the rise and probably the foundation of Rome, the north of Italy was covered with dense woods of elms, chestnuts and especially of oaks. Archaeology is here confirmed by history, for classical writers contain many references to Italian forests which have now disappeared. As late as the 4th century before our era, Rome was divided from central Etruria by the dreaded Ciminian forest, which Livy compares to the woods of Germany. No merchant, if we may trust the Roman historian, had ever penetrated its pathless solitudes, and it was deemed a most daring feat when a Roman general, after sending 2 scouts to explore its intricacies, led his army into the forest, and making his way to a ridge of the wooded mountains, looked down on the rich Etrurian fields spread out below. In Greece, beautiful woods of pine, oak, and other trees still linger on the slopes of the high Arcadian mountains, still adorned with their verdure, and deep gorge through which the Ladon hurries to join the sacred Alpheus, and was still, down to a few years ago, mirrored in the dark blue waters on the lonely lake of Phoenix. But they are mere fragments of the forest which clothed great tracts in antiquity, and which, at a more remote epoch, may have spanned the Greek peninsula from sea to sea. Tree worship practiced by all the Aryan races in Europe. From an examination of the Teutonic words for temple, Grimm has made it probable that amongst the Germans the oldest sanctuaries were natural woods. However this may be, Tree worship is well attested for all the great European families of the Aryan stock. Amongst the Celts, the oak worship of the Druids is familiar to everyone, and their old word for a sanctuary seems to be identical in origin, and meaning to the Latin nemus, a grove or wooded glade, which still survives in the name of Neme. Sacred groves were common among the ancient Germans, and tree worship is hardly extinct amongst their descendants at the present day. How serious their worship was in former times may be gathered from the ferocious penalty appointed by the old German laws for such as dared to peel the bark of a standing tree. The culprit's navel was to be cut out and nailed to the part of the tree which he had peeled, and he was to be driven round and round the tree till all his guts were wound about its trunk. The intention of the punishment clearly was to replace the dead bark by a living substitute taken from the culprit. It was a life for a life, the life of a man for the life of a tree. At Uppsala, the old religious capital of Sweden, there was a sacred grove in which every tree was regarded as divine. The heathen slaves worshipped trees and groves. The Lithuanians were not converted to Christianity till towards the close of the 14th century, and amongst them, at the date of their conversion, the worship of trees was prominent. Some of them revered remarkable oaks and other great shady trees, from which they received oracular responses. Some maintained holy groves about their villages or houses, where even to break a twig would have been a sin. They thought that he who cut a bough in such a grove either died suddenly or was crippled in one of his limbs. Proofs of the prevalence of tree worship in ancient Greece and Italy are abundant. In the sanctuary of Aesculapius at Kos, for example, it was forbidden to cut down the cypress trees under the penalty of 1,000 drachms. But nowhere perhaps in the ancient world was this antique form of religion better preserved than in the heart of the great metropolis itself. In the Forum, the busy centre of Roman life, the sacred fig tree of Romulus was worshipped down to the days of the Empire, and the withering of its trunk was enough to spread consternation through the city. Again, on the slope of the Palatine Hill grew a cornel tree which was esteemed one of the most sacred objects in Rome. Whenever the tree appeared to a passerby to be drooping, he set up a hue and cry which was echoed by the people in the street, and soon a crowd might be seen running helter-skelter from all sides with buckets of water, as if, says Plutarch, they were hastening to put out a fire. Tree worship among the Finnish-Ugrian peoples. Among the tribes of the Finnish-Ugrian stock in Europe, the heathen worship was performed for the most part in sacred groves, which were always enclosed with a fence. Such a grove, often considered merely of a glade or clearing, with a few trees dotted about, upon which in former times the skins of the sacrificial victims were hung. The central point of the grove, at least among the tribes of the Volga, was the sacred tree, beside which everything else sank into insignificance. Before it the worshippers assembled, and the priest offered his prayers. At its roots the victim was sacrificed, and its boughs sometimes served as a pulpit. No wood might be hewn and no branch broken in the grove, and women were generally forbidden to enter it. The Ostiaks and the Wogles, two people of the Finnish-Ugrian stock in Siberia, had also sacred groves in which nothing might be touched, and where the skins of the sacrificed animals were suspended. Other groves were not enclosed with fences. Near Kuopio, in Finland, there was a famous grove of ancient moss-grown firs, where the people offered sacrifices and practiced superstitious customs down to about 1650, when a sturdy veteran of the 30 Years' War dared to cut it down at the bidding of the pastor. Sacred groves now hardly exist in Finland, but sacred trees to which offerings are brought are still not very uncommon. On some firs, the skulls of bears are nailed, apparently that the hunter may have good luck in the chase. The Ostiaks are said never to have passed a sacred tree without shooting an arrow at it as a mark of respect. In many places they hung furs and skins on the holy trees in the forest, but having observed that these furs were often appropriated and carried off by unscrupulous travellers, they adopted the practice of hewing the trunks into great blocks, which they decked with their offerings and preserved in safe places. The custom marks a transition from the worship of trees to the worship of idols carved out of sacred wood. Within their sacred groves no grass or wood might be cut, no game hunted, no fish caught, not even a draught of water drunk. When they passed them in their canoes, they were careful not to touch the land with the oar, and if the journey through the hallowed ground was long, they laid in a store of water before entering on it, for they would rather suffer extreme thirst than slake it by drinking of the sacred stream. The Ostiaks also regarded as holy any tree to which an eagle had built its nest for several years, and they spared the bird as well as the tree. No greater injury could be done them than to shoot down an eagle or destroy its nest. Trees are regarded by the savage as animate, but it is necessary to examine in some detail the notions on which the worship of trees and plants is based. To the savage, the world in general is animate, and trees and plants are no exception to the rule. He thinks they have souls like his own, and he treats them accordingly. They say, writes the ancient vegetarian Porphyry, that primitive men led an unhappy life, for their superstition did not stop at animals, but extended even to plants. For why should the slaughter of an ox or a sheep be a greater wrong than the felling of a fir or an oak, saying that a soul is implanted in these trees also? Similarly, the Hidatsa Indians of North America believe that every natural object has its spirit, or to speak more properly, its shade. To these shades some consideration or respect is due, but not equally to all. For example, the shade of the cottonwood, the greatest tree in the valley of the upper Missouri, is supposed to possess an intelligence which, if properly approached, may help the Indians in certain undertakings, but the shades of shrubs and grasses are of little account. When the Missouri, swollen by a freshet in spring, carries away part of its banks and sweeps some tall tree into its current, it is said that the spirit of the tree cries while its roots still cling to the land and until the trunk falls with a splash into the stream. Formerly the Indians considered it wrong to fell one of these giants, and when large logs were needed they made use only of trees which had fallen off themselves. Till lately some of the more credulous old men declared that many of the misfortunes of their people were caused by its modern disregard for the rights of the living cottonwood. The Iroquois believed that each species of tree, shrub, plant, and herb had its own spirit, and these spirits it was their custom to return thanks. The Wanaka of Eastern Africa fancy that every tree, and especially every coconut tree, has its spirit. The destruction of a coconut tree is regarded as equivalent to matricide, because that tree gives them life and nourishment as a mother does her child. In the Asawa Islands of Fiji, a man will never eat a coconut without first asking its leave. May I eat you, my chief? Among the Thompson Indians of British Columbia, young people address the following prayer to the sunflower root before they ate the first roots of the season. I inform thee that I intend to eat thee. Mayest thou always help me to ascend, so that I may always be able to reach the tops of mountains, and may I never be clumsy. I ask this from thee, sunflower root. Thou art the greatest of all in mystery. To omit this prayer would have made the eater of the root lazy and caused him to sleep long in the morning. We are not told, but may conjecture that these Indians ascribed to the sunflower the sun's power of climbing above the mountain tops and of rising betimes in the morning. Hence, whoever ate of the plant with all the due formalities would naturally acquire the same useful properties. It is not so easy to say that why women had to observe continence in cooking and digging the root, and why, when they were cooking it, no man might come near the oven. The Dyaks ascribe souls to trees, and do not dare to cut down an old tree. In some places, when an old tree has been blown down, they set it up, smear it with blood, and deck it with flags to appease the soul of the tree. Siamese monks, believing that there are souls everywhere, and that to destroy anything, whatever is forcibly to dispossess a soul, will not break a branch of a tree, as they will not break the arm of an innocent person. These monks, of course, are Buddhists, but Buddhist animism is not a philosophical theory. It is simply a common savage dogma incorporated in a system of an historical religion. To suppose with Benfey and others that the theories of animism and transmigration current among rude peoples of Asia are derived from Buddhism is to reverse the facts. Buddhism in this respect borrowed from savagery, not savagery from Buddhism. According to Chinese belief, the spirits of plants are never shaped like plants, but have commonly the form either of human beings or of animals, for example, bulls or serpents. Occasionally at the felling of a tree, the tree spirit has been seen to rush out in the shape of the blue bull. In China to this day, the belief that tree spirits dangerous to man is obviously strong. In southern Fujian, it deters people from felling any large trees or chopping off heavy branches, for fear the indwelling spirit may become irritated and visit the aggressor or his neighbours with disease and calamity. Especially respected are the green banyan or qing, the biggest trees to be found in that part of China. In Amoy, some people even show a strong aversion from planting trees, the planters, as soon as the stems have been as thick as their necks, being sure to be throttled by the indwelling spirits. No explanation of this curious superstition was ever given us. It may account to some extent for the almost total neglect of forestry in that part of China, so that hardly any except spontaneous trees grow there. Particular sorts of trees, tenanted by spirits. Sacrifices to tree spirits. Sometimes it is only particular sorts of trees that are supposed to be tenanted by spirits. At Bough in Dalmatia, it is said that among great beeches, oaks and other trees, there are some that are endowed with shades or souls, and whoever fells one of them must die on the spot, or at least live an invalid for the rest of his days. If woodman fears that a tree which he has felled is one of this sort, he must cut off the head of a live hen on the stump of the tree with the very same axe with which he cut down the tree. This will protect him from all harm, even if the tree be one of the animated kind. Silk cotton trees in West Africa. The silk cotton trees, which rear their enormous trunks to a stupendous height, far outtopping all the other trees of the forest, are regarded with reverence throughout West Africa, from the Senegal to the Niger, and are believed to be the abode of a god or spirit. Among the Uwe-speaking peoples of the Slave Coast, the indwelling god of this giant of the forest goes by the name of Huntin. Trees in which he especially dwells, for it is not every silk cotton tree that he thus honours, are surrounded by a girdle of palm trees. The sacrifices of fowls and occasionally of human beings are fastened to the trunk or laid against the foot of the tree. A tree distinguished by a girdle of palm leaves may not be cut down or injured in any way, but even silk cotton trees, which are not supposed to be animated by hunting, may not be felled unless the woodsman first offers a sacrifice of fowls and palm oil to purge himself by the proposed sacrilege. To omit the sacrifice is an offence which may be punished with death. Sycamores in ancient Egypt. Everywhere in Egypt, on the borders of the cultivated land, and even at some distance from the valley of the Nile, you meet with fine sycamores standing solitary and thriving as by a miracle in the sandy soil. Their living green contrasts strongly with the tawny hue of the surrounding landscape, and their thick impenetrable foliage bids defiance even in summer to the noonday sun. The secret of the verdure is that their roots strike down into rills of water that trickle by unseen sluices from the great river. Of all the Egyptians of every rank esteemed these trees divine and applied them regular homage. They gave them figs, raisins, cucumbers, vegetables, and water in earthenware pitchers, which charitable folk filled afresh every day. Passers-by slaked their thirst at these pitchers in the sultry hours, and paid for the welcome draught by a short prayer. The spirit that animated these beautiful trees generally lurked unseen, but sometimes he would show his head or even his whole body outside the trunk, and only to retire into it again. Sacred trees in Africa, Syria, and Patagonia. People in Congo set calabashes of palm wine at the foot of certain trees, for the trees to drink when they are thirsty. The Wanaka of Eastern Africa pays special honor to the spirits of coconut palms in return for the many benefits conferred on them by the trees. To cut down a coconut palm is an inexplicable offense, equivalent to matricide. They sacrifice to the tree on many occasions. When a man in gathering the coconuts has fallen from the palm, they attribute it to the wrath of the tree spirit, and resort to the oddest means of appeasing him. The Maasai particularly reverence the sabugo tree, the bark of which has medical properties, and a species of parasitic fig which they call ritete. The green figs are eaten by boys and girls, and older people appropriate the tree by pouring the blood of a goat to the foot of the trunk and strewing grass on branches. The natives of the Bisagos Islands off the west coast of Africa sacrifice dogs, cocks and oxen to their sacred trees, and they eat the flesh of the victims and leave only the horns fastened to the trees for the spirits. In a Turkish village of northern Syria, there is a very old oak tree which the people worship, burning incense to it and bringing offerings as they would to a shrine. In Patagonia, between the Rio Negro and the Rio Colorado, there stands solitary an ancient acacia tree with a gnarled and hollow trunk. The Indians revere it as the abode of a spirit and hang offerings of blankets, ponchos, ribbons, and coloured threads on it, so that the tree presents the aspect of an old clothes shop, the tattered weather-worn garments drooping sadly from the boughs. No Indian passes it without leaving something, if it be only a little horsehair which he ties to a branch. The hollow trunk contains offerings, tobacco, beads, and sometimes coins. But the best evidence of the sanctity of the tree are the bleached skeletons of many horses which have been killed in honour of the spirit. for the horse is the most precious sacrifice that these Indians can offer. They slaughter the animal also to propitiate the spirits of the deep and rapid rivers, which they have often to ford or swim. Sacrifices to trees. The Kenyans in central Borneo ascribe souls to the trees which yield the poison they use to envenom their arrows. They think that the spirit of the tassim tree, Antiaris toxicarea, is particularly hard to please. But if the wood has a strong and agreeable scent, they know that the man who felled the tree must have contrived by his offerings to mollify the peevish spirit. In some of the Louisiade Islands, there are certain large trees under which the natives hold their feasts. These trees seem to be regarded as endowed with souls, for a portion of the feast is set aside for them, and the bones of pigs and of human beings are everywhere deeply embedded in their branches. Among the Kangaroo Mountains of the Punjab, a girl used to be annually sacrificed to an old cedar tree, the families of the village taking it in turn to supply the victim. The tree was cut down not very many years ago. On Christmas Eve it is still customary in some parts of Germany to gird fruit trees with ropes of straw on which the sausages prepared for the festival had lain. This is supposed to make the trees bear fruit. In the mark of Brandenburg, the person who ties a straw round the tree says, "Little tree, I make you a present. He will make me one." The people say that if the trees receive gifts, they will bestow gifts in return. The custom, which is clearly a relic of tree worship, is often observed on New Year's night, or at any time between Christmas and Twelfth Night. Trees supposed to be sensitive and feel wounds. If trees are animate, they are necessarily sensitive, and the cutting of them down becomes a delicate surgical operation, which must be performed with as tender a regard as possible for the feelings of the sufferers, who otherwise may turn and rend the careless or bungling operator. When an oak is being felled, it gives a kind of shrieks or groans that may be heard a mile off, as it were the genius of the oak lamenting. E. Wild Esquire hath heard it several times. The Ojibways very seldom cut down green or living trees from the idea that puts them to pain, and some of the medicine men profess to have heard the wailing of the trees under the axe. Trees that bleed and utter cries of pain or indignation when they are hacked or burned occur very often in Chinese books, even in standard histories. Old peasants in some parts of Austria still believe that forest trees are animate, and will not allow an incision to be made in the bark without special cause. They have heard from their fathers that the tree feels the cut not less than a wooden man is hurt. Apologies offered to trees for cutting them down. In felling a tree that begets pardon, it is said that in the upper Palatinate, also old woodmen still secretly ask a fine, sound tree to forgive them before they cut it down. So in Jaraquino, the woodman craves pardon of the tree he fells. Before the Ilocanes of Luzon cut down trees in the virgin forests or on the mountains, they recite some verses to the following effect. Be not uneasy, my old friend, though we fell what we have been ordered to fell. This they do in order not to draw down on themselves the hatred of the spirits who live in the trees, and who are apt to avenge themselves by visiting with grievous sickness such as injure them wantonly. When the Tagalogs of the Philippines wish to pluck a flower, they ask leave of the genius, nono, of the flower to do so. When they are obliged to cut down a tree, they beg pardon of the genius of the tree and excuse themselves by saying that it was the priest who bade them fell it. Among the Tigre-speaking tribes of North Abyssinian people are afraid to fell a green and fruit-bearing tree lest they incur the curse of God, which is heard in the groaning of the tree as it sinks to the ground. But if a man is bold enough to cut down such a tree, he will say to it, "Thy curse abide in thee," or he will allege that it was not he, but an elephant or a rhinoceros that knocked it down. Amongst the Hors of Tukaland in West Africa, when a man wishes to make palm wine, he hires woodmen to fell the trees. They go in the palm wood, set some meal on the ground, and say to the wood, "That is your food. The old man at home sent us to cut you down. We are still children who know nothing at all. The old man at home has sent us." They say this because they think that the wood is a spirit, and that it is angry with them. Before the Karabatak cuts down a tree, he will offer a betel and apologies, and if in passing the place afterwards he should see the tree weeping, or as we should say, exuding sap, he hastens to console it by sprinkling the blood of a fowl on a stump. The Basoga of Central Africa think that when a tree is cut down, The angry spirit which inhabits it may cause the death of the chief and his family. To prevent this disaster, they consult a medicine man before they fell a tree. If a man of skill gives leave to proceed, the woodman first offers a fowl and a goat to the tree. Then as soon as he has given the first blow with the axe, he applies his mouth to the cut and sucks some of the sap. In this way he forms a brotherhood with the tree, just as two men become blood brothers by sucking each other's blood. After that he cuts down his tree brother with impunity. An ancient Indian ritual directs that in preparing to fell a tree, the woodman should lay a stalk of grass on the spot where the blow is to fall, with the words, "O plant, shield it," and that he should say to the axe, "O axe, hurt it not." When the tree is fallen, he poured melted butter on the stump, saying, "Grow thou out of this, O Lord, or the forest grow with 100 shoots. May we grow with 1,000 shoots." They anointed the severed stem and wound a rope of grass around it.
Bleeding trees. Again, when a tree or plant is cut, it is sometimes thought to bleed. Some Indians dare not cut a certain plant, because there comes out a red juice which they take for the blood of the plant. In Samoa, there was a grove of trees which no one dared hew down. Once some strangers tried to do so, but blood flowed from the tree, and the sacrilegious strangers fell ill and died. Down to 1859, there stood a sacred large tree at Nordares in the Tyrol, which was thought to bleed whenever it was cut. Moreover, people fancied that the steel pierced the woodman's body to the same depth that it pierced the tree, and that the wound on his body would not heal until the bark closed over the scar on the trunk. So sacred was the tree that no one would gather fuel or cut timber near it, and to curse, scold, or quarrel in its neighbourhood was regarded as a crying sin, which would be supernaturally punished on the spot. Angry disputes were often hushed with the warning whisper, "Don't, the sacred tree is here."
Trees threatened order to make them bear fruit. But the spirits of vegetation are not always treated with deference and respect. If fair words and kind treatment do not move them, stronger measures are sometimes resorted to. The durian tree of the East Indies, whose smooth stem often shoots up to a height of 80 or 90 feet without sending out a branch, bears a fruit of the most delicious flavour and the most disgusting stench. The Malays cultivate the tree for the sake of its fruit, and have been known to resort to a peculiar ceremony for the purpose of stimulating its fertility. Near Jugra in Selangor, there is a small grove of durian trees, and on a specially chosen day, the villagers used to assemble in it. Thereupon, one of the local sorcerers would take out a hatchet and deliver several shrewd blows on the trunk on the most barren of the trees, saying, "Will you now bear fruit or not? If you do not, I shall fell you." To this the tree replied, through the mouth of another man who had climbed a mangosteen tree hard by, the durian tree being unclimbable, "Yes, I will now bear fruit. I beg you not to fell me." So in Japan, to make trees bear fruit, two men go into an orchard. One of them climbs up a tree, and the other stands at the foot with an axe. The man with the axe asks the tree whether it will yield a good crop next year, and threatens to cut it down if it does not. To this the man among the branches replies on behalf of the tree that it will bear abundantly. Odd as this mode of horticulture may seem to us, it has its exact parallels in Europe. On Christmas Eve, many a South Slavonian and Bulgarian peasant swings an axe threateningly against the barren fruit tree, whilst another man standing by intercedes for the menaced tree, saying, "Do not cut it down, it will soon bear fruit." Thrice the axe is swung, and thrice the impending blow is arrested at the entreaty of the intercessor. After that, the frightened tree will certainly bear fruit next year. So at the village of Acria in Sicily, if a tree obstinately refuses to bear fruit, the owner pretends to hew it down. Just as the axe is about to fall, a friend intercedes for the tree, begging him to have patience for 1 year more, and promising not to interfere again if the culprit has not mended his ways by then. The owner grants his request, and the Sicilians say that a tree seldom remains deaf to such menace. The ceremony is performed on Easter Sunday. In Armenia, the same pantomime is sometimes performed by two men for the same purpose on Good Friday. In the Abruzzi, the ceremony takes place before sunrise on the morning of St. John's Day, Midsummer Day. The owner threatens the trees, which are slow to bear fruit. Thrice he walks round each sluggard, repeating his threat and striking the trunk with the head of an axe. In Lesbos, when an orange tree or a lemon tree does not bear fruit, the owner will sometimes set a looking glass before the tree, then standing with an axe in his hand over against the tree, and gazing at his reflection in the glass, he will feign to fall into a passion and will say aloud, "Bear fruit or I'll cut you down," when cabbages merely curl their leaves instead of forming heads as they ought to do. The Estonian peasant will go out into the garden before sunrise, clad only in a shirt and armed with a scythe, which he sweeps over the refractory vegetables as if he meant to cut them down. This intimidates the cabbages and brings them to a sense of their duty.
Attempts to deceive the spirits of trees and plants. If European peasants thus know how to work on the foods of cabbages and fruit trees, the subtle Malay has learned how to overreach the simple souls of the plants and trees that grow in his native land. Thus when a bunch of fruit hangs from an aran palm tree, and in reaching after it you tread on some of the fallen fruit, the Galeries say that you ought to grunt like a wild boar in order that your feet may not itch. The chain of reasoning seems weak to a European mind, but the natives find no flaw in it. They have observed that wild boars are fond of the fruit, and run freely about among it as it lies on the ground. From this they infer that the animal's feet are proof against the itch which men suffer through treading on the fruit. Hence they conclude that if by grunting in a natural and lifelike manner you can impress the fruit with the belief that you are a pig, it will treat your feet as tenderly as the feet of his friends, the real pigs. Again, pregnant women in Java sometimes take a fancy to eat the wild species of a particular plant, Colocasia antiquarian, which on account of its exceedingly pungent taste is not commonly used as food by human beings, though it is relished by pigs. In such a case it becomes the husband's duty to go and look for the plant, but before he gathers it, he takes care to grunt loudly in order that the plant may take him for a pig, and so mitigate the pungency of its flavour. Again, in the Manduan district of Java, there grows a plant of which the fruit is believed to be injurious for men, but not for apes. The urchins who herd buffaloes and to whom nothing edible comes amiss eat this fruit also, but before plucking it, they take the precaution of mimicking the voices of apes, in order to persuade the plant that its fruit is destined for the maw of these creatures. Once more the Javanese scrape the rind of a certain plant, Sarcolobus narcoticus, into a powder, with which they poison such dangerous beasts as tigers and wild boars. But the rind is believed not to be a poison for men. Hence the person who gathers the plant has to observe certain precautions in order that its baneful quality may not be lost in passing through his hands. He approaches it naked and creeping on all fours to make the plant think that he is a ravenous beast and not a man, and to strengthen the illusion he bites the stalk. After that the deadly property of the rind is assured. But even when the plant is being gathered and the powder made from it in strict accordance with certain superstitions and rules, care is still needed in handling the powder, which is regarded as alive and intelligent. It may not be brought near a corpse, nor may a corpse be carried past the house in which the powder is kept, for if either of these things were to happen, the powder, seeing the corpse, would hastily conclude that it had already done its work, and so all its noxious quality would be gone. The Indians of the upper Orinoco extract a favourite beverage from certain palm trees which grow in the forests. In order to make the trees bear abundance of fruit, the medicine men blow sacred trumpets under them. But how this is supposed to produce the desired effect does not appear. The trumpets, or tudos, are objects of religious veneration. No woman may look upon them under pain of death. Candidates for initiation into the mysteries of the trumpet must be men of good character and celibate. The initiated members scourge each other, fast, and practice other austerities. Trees married to each other. The conception of trees and plants as emanated beings naturally results in treating them as male and female who can be married to each other in a real and not merely a figurative or poetical sense of the word. The notion is not purely fanciful, for plants, like animals, have their sexes and reproduce their kind by the union of the male and female elements. But whereas in all the higher animals, the organs of the two sexes are regularly separated between different individuals, in most plants they exist together in every individual of the species. This rule, however, is by no means universal, and in many species the male plant is distinct from the female. The distinction appears to have been observed by some savages, for we are told that the Maoris are acquainted with the sex of trees, etc., and have distinct names for the male and female of some trees. Artificial fertilization of the date palm. The ancients knew the difference between the male and the female date palm
and fertilize them artificially by shaking the pollen of the male tree over the flowers of the female. The fertilization took place in spring. Among the heathen of Haran, the month during which the palms were fertilized bore the name of the date month, and at this time they celebrated the marriage festival of all the gods and goddesses. Marriages of trees in India. Different from this true and fruitful marriage of the palm are the false and barren marriages of plants which play a part in Hindu superstition. For example, if a Hindu has planted a grove of mango, neither he nor his wife may taste of the fruit until he has formally married one of the trees, as a bridegroom, to a tree of a different sort, commonly a tamarind tree, which grows near it in the grove. If there is no tamarind to act as bride, a jasmine will serve the turn. The expenses of such a marriage are often considerable, for the more Brahmins are feasted at it, the greater the glory of the owner of the grove. A family has been known to sell its golden and silver trinkets and to borrow all the money they could in order to marry the mango tree to a jasmine with due pomp and ceremony. According to another account of this ceremony, a branch of a bar tree is brought and fixed near one of the mango trees in the grove to represent the bar or bridegroom, and both are wrapped round the same piece of cloth by the owner of the grove and his wife. To complete the ceremony, a bamboo basket containing the bride's belongings and dowry on a miniature scale is provided, and after the Brahmin priest has done his part, vermilion, the emblem of a complete marriage, is applied to the mango as to a bride.
Marriage of the holy basil. Another plant which figures as a bride in Hindu rites is tulasi, or holy basil, or Sinum sanctum. It is a small shrub, not too big to be grown in a large flower pot, and is often placed in rooms. Indeed, there is hardly a respectable Hindu family that does not possess one. In spite of its humble appearance, the shrub is pervaded by the essence of Vishnu and his wife Lakshmi, and is itself worshipped daily as a deity. The following prayer is often addressed to it. I adore that tulasi, in whose roots are all the sacred places of pilgrimage, and whose centre are all the deities, and in whose upper branches are all the Vedas. The plant is especially a woman's divinity, being regarded as an embodiment of Vishnu's wife Lakshmi, or Rama's wife Sita, or Krishna's wife Rukmini. Women worship it by walking round it and praying or offering flowers and rice to it. Now this sacred plant, as the embodiment of a goddess, is annually married to the god Krishna in every Hindu family. The ceremony takes place in the month Kartika, or November. In Western India, they often bring an idol of the youthful Krishna in a gorgeous palanquin, followed by a long train of attendants, to the house of a rich man to be wedded to the basil, and the festivities are celebrated with great pomp. Again, as a wife of Vishnu, the holy basil was married to the salagrama, a black fossil ammonite, which is regarded as an embodiment of Vishnu. In northwestern India, this marriage of the plant to the fossil has to be performed before it is lawful to taste of the fruit of a new orchard. A man holding the fossil personates the bridegroom, another holding the basil represents the bride. After burning a sacrificial fire, the officiating Brahmin puts the usual questions to the couple about to be united. Bride and bridegroom walk 6 times around a small spot marked out in the center of the orchard. Further, no well is considered lucky until the salagrama has been solemnly wedded to the holy basil, which stands for the garden that the well is intended to water. The relations assemble. The owner of the garden represents the bridegroom, while a kinsman of his wife personates the bride. Gifts are given to the Brahmins. A feast is held in the garden, and after that both garden and well may be used without danger. The same marriage of the sacred fossil to the sacred plant is celebrated annually by the Raja of Orkha at Lukara. A former Raja used to spend a sum equal to about £30,000, being 1/4 of his revenue, upon the ceremony. On one occasion, over 100,000 people are said to have been present at the rite, and to have been feasted at the expense of the Raja. The procession consisted of 8 elephants, 1,200 camels, and 4,000 horses, all mounted and elegantly caparisoned. The most sumptuously decorated of the elephants carried the fossil god to pay his bridal visit to the little shrub goddess. On such an occasion, all the rites of a regular marriage are performed,
Afterwards, the newly wedded couple are left to repose together in the temple till the next year. On Christmas Eve, German peasants used to tie fruit trees together with straw ropes to make them bear fruit, saying that the trees were thus married. Trees in blossom and rice in bloom, treated like pregnant women. In the Moluccas, when the clove trees are in blossom, they are treated like pregnant women. No noise may be made near them. No light or fire may be carried past them at night. No one may approach them with his hat on. All must uncover in their presence. These precautions are observed lest the tree should be allowed to bear no fruit, or it should drop its fruit too soon, like the untimely delivery of a woman who has been frightened in pregnancy. So in the East, the growing rice crop is often treated with the same considerate regard as a breeding woman. As in Mbonya, when the rice is in bloom, the people say that it is pregnant, and fire no guns and make no other noises near the field, for fear lest, ere the rice were thus disturbed, it would miscarry, and the crop will be all straw and no grain. The Javanese also regard the bloom on the rice as a sign that the plant is pregnant, and they treat it accordingly by mingling in the water that irrigates the fields a certain astringent food prepared from sour fruit, which is believed to be wholesome for women with child. In some districts of western Borneo, there must be no talk of corpses or demons in the fields, else the spirit of the growing rice will be frightened and flee away to Java. The Turbungos of central Celebes will not fire a gun in a rice field, lest the rice shall be frightened away. The Chams of Bin Thorn in Cochin, China, do not dare to touch the rice in the granary at midday, because the rice is then asleep, and it would be both rude and dangerous to disturb its noonday slumber. In Orissa, growing rice is considered as a pregnant woman, and the same ceremonies are observed with regard to it as in the case of human females. In Poso, a district of central Celebes, when the rice ears are beginning to form, women go through the field feeding the young ears with soft boiled rice to make them grow fast. They carry the food in calabashes, and grasping the ears in their hands, bend them over into the vessels that they may partake of the strengthening fat. The reason for boiling the rice soft is that the ears are regarded as young children who could not digest rice cooked in the usual way. The Tomori of central Celebes feed the ripened rice by touching it with the contents of a broken one. When the grain begins to form, the people of Gayo, a district of southern Sumatra, regard the rice as pregnant and feed it with a pap composed of rice meal, coconut, and treacle, which they deposit on leaves in the middle and at the corners of the field. But when the crop is plentiful and the rice is being threshed, they give it water to drink at a pitcher, which they bury to the neck in the heap of grain. Trees supposed to be tenanted by the souls of the dead. Sometimes it is the souls of the dead which are believed to animate trees. The Daeri tribe of South Australia regard as very sacred certain trees which are supposed to be their fathers transformed. Hence they speak with reverence of the trees, and are careful they shall not be cut down and burned. If the settlers require them to hew down the trees, they earnestly protest against it, asserting that were they to do so, they would have no luck. They might be punished for not protecting their ancestors. Some of the Philippine Islanders believe that the souls of their ancestors are in certain trees, which they therefore spare. If they are obliged to fell one of these trees, they excuse themselves to it by saying that it was the priest who made them do it. The spirits take up their abode by preference in tall and stately trees with great spreading branches. When the wind rustles the leaves, the natives fancy it is the voice of the spirit, and they never pass near one of these trees without bowing respectfully, and asking pardon of the spirit for disturbing his repose. Among the Igorots, in the district of Lepanto, every village has its sacred tree, in which the souls of the dead forefathers of the hamlet reside. Offerings are made to the trees, and any injury done to it is believed to entertain some misfortune in the village. Were the tree cut down, the village and all its inhabitants would inevitably perish. Natives of Bontoc, a province in the north of Luzon, cut down the woods near their villages, but leave a few fine trees standing as the abode of the spirits of their ancestors, Anitos, and they honor the spirits by depositing food under the trees. The Dyaks believe that when a man dies by accident, as by drowning, it is a sign that the gods mean to exclude him in the realms of bliss. Accordingly, his body is not buried. but carried into the forest, and there laid down. The souls of such unfortunates pass into trees or animals or fish, and are much dreaded by the Dyaks, who abstain from using certain kinds of wood or eating certain sorts of fish, because they are supposed to contain the souls of the dead. Once while walking with a Dyak through the jungle, Sir Hugh Lau observed that his companion, after raising his sword to strike a great snake, suddenly arrested his arm and suffered the reptile to escape. On asking the reason, he was told by the Dyak that the bush in front of which they were standing had been a man, a kinsman of his own, who died some 10 years before and appeared in a dream to his widow and told her that he had become that particular bamboo tree. Hence the ground and everything on it was sacred, and the serpent might not be interfered with. The Dyak further related that in spite of the warning given to the woman in his vision, a man had been hardly enough to cut a branch of the tree, but that fool had paid for his temerity with his life, for he died soon afterwards. A little bamboo altar stood in front of the bush, on which the remnants of offerings presented to the spirit of the tree were still visible when Sir Hugh Lau passed that way. Trees supposed to be tenanted by the souls of the dead. In Korea, the souls of people who die of the plague which they have to be cast out by the sorcerer. The Warramunga Australia ceremonies at felling trees. Not a few ceremonies observed at cutting down haunted trees are based on the belief that the spirits have it in their power to quit the trees at pleasure or in case of need. Thus, when the Pellew Islanders are felling a tree, they conjure the spirit of the tree to leave it and settle on another. The wily Negro of the Slave Coast who wishes to fell an shortened tree, but knows that he cannot do it so long as the spirit remains in the tree, places a little palm oil on the ground as a bait, and then, when the unsuspecting spirit has quitted the tree to partake in this dainty, hastens to cut down its late abode. The Alfours of Boso in central Celise believe that great trees are inhabited by demons in human form, and the taller the tree, the more powerful the demon. Accordingly, they are careful not to fell such trees, and they leave offerings inhabited by a spirit. Before the tree, they however, the motive for placing a sprig on the stump is said to be to deceive the spirit into thinking that the fallen stem is still growing in its old place. The Gilyaks insert a stick with curled shavings on the stump of the tree which they have felled, believing that in this way they give back to the dispossessed tree spirit his life and soul. German woodmen make a cross on the stump while the tree is falling, in the belief that this enables the spirit of the tree to live upon the stump. Before they get told to fell a forest tree, they choose a tree of the same kind and worship it by presenting a coconut, burning incense, applying red pigment and begging it to bless the undertaking. The intention perhaps is to induce the spirit of the former tree to shift its quarters to the latter. In clearing a wood, a galleries must not cut down the last tree till the spirit in it has been induced to go away. When the Dyaks fell the jungle on the hills, they often leave a few trees standing on the hilltops as a refuge for the dispossessed tree spirits. Sailing up the Baram River in Sarawak, you pass from time to time a clearing in the forest where manioc is cultivated. In the middle of every one of these clearings, a solitary tree is always left standing as a home for the ejected spirits of the wood. Its boughs are stripped off, all but the topmost, and just under its leafy crown, two cross pieces are fastened from which rags dangle. Similarly, in India, the Gonds allow a grove of typical trees to remain as a home or reserve for the woodland spirits when they are clearing away a jungle. The Mandaras have sacred groves which were left standing when the land was cleared, lest the sylvan gods, disquieted at the felling of the trees, should abandon the place. The Miris in Assam are unwilling to break up new land for cultivation, so long as there is fallow land available, but they fear to offend the spirits of the woods by hewing down trees needlessly. On the other hand, when a child has been lost, the Padams of Assam think that it has been stolen by the spirits of the wood, so they retaliate on the spirits by felling trees till they find the child. The spirits, fearing to be left without a tree in which to lodge, give up the child, and is found in the fork of a tree. Appropriating tree spirits and house and timber. Even when a tree has been felled, sawn into planks, and used to build a house, it is possible that the woodland spirit may still be lurking in the timber, and accordingly some people seek to appropriate him before or after they occupy the new house. Hence, when a new dwelling is ready, The Torojas of Central Sleeves kill a goat, a pig or a buffalo, and smear all the woodwork with his blood. If the building is a lobo or spirit house, a fowl or a dog is killed on the ridge of the roof, and its blood allowed to flow down on both sides. The Ruder Tornapu in such a case sacrifice a human being on the roof. This sacrifice on the roof of a lobo or temple serves the same purpose as the smearing of blood in the woodwork of an ordinary house. The intention is to appropriate the forest spirits who may still be in the timber. They are thus put in good humour and will do the inmates of the house no harm. For a like reason, people in Celebes and the Moluccas are much afraid of planting a post upside down at the building of a house, for the forest spirit, who might still be in the timber, would very naturally resent this indignity and visit the inmates with sickness. The Bahoas or Kanyans of central Borneo are of opinion that tree spirits stand very stiffly on the point of honour and visit men with their displeasure for any injury done to them. Hence, after building a house whereby they have been forced to ill-treat many trees, these people observe a period of penance for a year, during which they must abstain from many things such as the killing of bears, tiger cats, and serpents. The period of taboo is brought to an end by a ceremony of which headhunting, or the presence of it, plays a part. The Uluwayar Dayaks of the Monday River are still more punctilious in their observance of taboos after building a house. The length of the penance depends chiefly on the kind of timber used in the construction of the dwelling. If the timber was the valuable ironwood, the inmates of the house must deny themselves various dainties for 3 years, but the spirits of humbler trees are less exacting. When the Kayans have felled an ironwood tree in order to cut it up into planks for a roof, they will offer a pig to the spirits of the tree, hoping thus to prevent the spirits from molesting the souls of persons assembled under the roof. Sacred trees, the abode of spirits. Thus the tree is regarded as sometimes of the body, sometimes as merely the house of the tree spirit. And when we read of sacred trees, which may not be cut down because they are the seat of spirits, it is not always possible to say with certainty in which way the presence of the spirit in the tree is conceived. In the following cases, perhaps the trees are regarded as the dwelling places of the spirits rather than as their bodies. The sea Dyaks point to many a tree as sacred because it is the abode of a spirit or spirits, and to cut one of these down would provoke the spirit's anger, who might avenge himself by visiting the sacrilegious woodman with sickness. The Batas of Sumatra have been known to refuse to cut down certain trees because they were the abode of mighty spirits who would resent the injury. One of the largest and stateliest of the forest trees in Perak is known as Toalong. It has a very poisonous sap which produces great irritation when it comes into contact with the skin. Many trees of this species have large hollow knobs on their trunks where branches have been broken off. These knobs are looked upon by the Malays as houses of spirits, and they object strongly to cut down trees that are thus disfigured, believing that the man who fells one of them will die within a year. When clearings are made in the forest, these trees are generally left standing to the annoyance and expense of planters. The Siamese fear to cut down any very fine trees, as they should incur the anger of the powerful spirits who inhabit them. The Yen, a tribe of Upper Burma, worship the spirits of hills and forests, and over great tracts of country they will not lay out fields for fear of offending the spirits. They say that if a tree is felled, a man dies. In every coned village, a large grove, generally of sal trees, Shoria robusta, is dedicated to the forest god, whose favour is sought by the sacrifice of birds, hogs, and sheep, together with an offering of rice and an adult egg. This sacred grove is religiously preserved. The young trees are occasionally pruned, but not a twig may be cut for use without the formal consent of the village and the ceremonial propitiation of the god. In some parts of Berar, the holy groves are so carefully preserved that during the annual festivals held in them, it is customary to gather and burn solemnly all dead and fallen branches and trees. The Larga Kols of India believe that the tops of trees are the abode of spirits who are disturbed by the felling of the trees and will take vengeance. The Parhiya, a Dravidian tribe of Mirzapur, think that evil spirits live in the Sal Pipal and Mahua trees. They make offerings to such trees and will not climb into their branches. In Travancore, demons are supposed to reside in certain large old trees, which it would be sacrilegious and dangerous to hew down. A rough stone is generally placed at the foot of one of these trees as an image or emblem, and turmeric powder is rubbed on it. Some of the western tribes of British New Guinea dread certain female devils who inhabit large trees and are very dangerous. Trees supposed to be the abode of these demons are treated with much respect and never cut down. Near Old Calabar, there is a ravine full of the densest and richest vegetation, whence a stream of limpid water flows purling to the river. The spot was considered by a late king to be hallowed ground, the residence of Anansa, the tutelary god of Old Calabar. The people had strict orders to revere the grove. No branch of it might be cut. Among the Bambaras of the upper Niger, every village has its sacred tree, generally a tamarind, which is supposed to be the abode of the fetish and is carefully preserved. The fetish is consulted on every important occasion, and sacrifices of sheep, dogs and fowls accompanied with offerings of millet and fruits are made under the sacred tree. In the deserts of Arabia, a modern traveller found a great solitary acacia tree, which the Bedouin believed to be possessed by a jinni. Shreds of cotton and horns of goats hung among the boughs, and nails were knocked into the trunk. An Arab strongly dissuaded the traveller from cutting a branch of the tree, assuring him that it was death to do so. The Yoroks, who inhabit the southern coast of Asia Minor and the heights of Mount Taurus, have sacred trees which they never cut down for fear of driving away the spirits that own them. The old Prussians believed their gods inhabited tall trees, such as oaks, from which they gave audible answers to inquirers. Hence these trees were not felled or worshipped as the home of divinities. Amongst the trees as venerated by them was the elder tree. The Samagatins thought that if anyone ventured to injure certain groves, or the birds or beasts in them, the spirits would make his hands or feet crooked. Down to the 19th century, the Ausonians stood in such awe of many trees, which they considered as the seat of mighty spirits. They would not even pluck a flower or a berry on the ground where the shadow of the trees fell, much less would they dare to break a branch from the tree itself.
Sacred groves. Even where no mention is made of wood spirits, we may generally assume that when trees or groves are sacred and inviolable, it is because they are believed to be either inhabited or animated by sylvan deities. In central India, the Bough tree, Ficus indica, and the pipal tree, Ficus religiosa, are sacred, and every child learns the saying that it is better to die a leper than pluck a leaf of a pipal, and he who can wound a bar will kick his little sister. In Livonia, there is a sacred grove in which, if any man fells a tree or breaks a branch, he will die within a year. The Wotyaks have sacred groves. A Rajan who ventured to hew a tree in one of them fell sick and died the next day. The heathen Cheremis of southeastern Russia have sacred groves, and woe to him who dares to fell one of the holy trees. If the author of the sacrilege is unknown, they take a cock or a goose, torture it to death, and then throw it on the fire, while they pray to the gods to punish the sinner and cause him to perish like the bird. Near a chapel of St. Ninan, in the parish of Billy, there stood more than a century and a half ago a row of trees, all of equal size, thick, planted for about the length of a butt, which were looked upon by the superstitious papists as sacred trees, for which they reckon it sacrilege to take so much as a branch or any of the fruit. So in the island of Skye, some 250 years ago, there was a holy lake, surrounded by a fair wood, which none presumes to cut, and those who venture to infringe its sanctity by breaking even a twig, either sickened on the spot or visited afterwards by some signal inconvenience. Sacrifices offered by cutting down trees are doubtless meant to appease the wood spirits. In Gilgat it is usual to sprinkle goat's blood on a tree of any kind before felling it. The Akiku of British East Africa hold the Mugumo or Mugumo tree, a species of fig, sacred on account of its size and fine appearance. Hence they do not ruthlessly cut it down like all other trees, which corner a patch of ground that is to be cleared for tillage. Groves of this tree are sacred. In them no axe may be laid to any tree, no branch broken, no firewood gathered, and no grass burnt, and wild animals which have taken refuge there may not be molested. In these sacred groves, sheep and goats are sacrificed, and prayers are offered for rain or fine weather, or in behalf of sick children. The whole meat of the sacrifices is left on the ground for God, Nagai, to eat. The fat is placed in a cleft of the trunk or in the branches as a titbit for him. He lives up to the boughs, but comes down to partake of the food.
End of Section 2. Section 3, Chapter 9, Subchapter 2, Beneficial Power of Tree Spirits. Transition of Tree Spirit into Anthropomorphic Deity of the Woods. When a tree comes to be viewed, no longer as a body of the tree spirit, but simply as its abode, which can quit at pleasure, an important advance has been made in religious thought. Animism is passing into polytheism. In other words, instead of regarding each tree as a living and conscious being, man now sees in it merely a lifeless inert mass, tenanted for a longer or shorter time by a supernatural being, who, as he can pass freely from tree to tree, thereby enjoys a certain right of possession or lordship over the trees, and ceasing to be a tree soul, becomes a forest god. As soon as the tree spirit is thus, in a measure, disengaged from each particular tree, it begins to change its shape and assume the body of a man in virtue of a general tendency of early thought to clothe all abstract spiritual beings in concrete human form. Hence, in classical art, the sylvan deities are depicted in human shape, their woodland character being denoted by a branch with some equally obvious symbol. But this change of shape does not affect the essential character of the tree spirit. The powers which he exercised as a tree soul incorporated in a tree, he still continues to wield as a god of trees. This I shall now attempt to prove in detail. I shall show, first, that trees considered as animate beings are credited with the power of making the rain to fall, the sun to shine, flocks and herds to multiply, and women to bring forth easily. And second, that the very same powers are attributed to tree gods conceived as anthropomorphic beings, or as actually incarnate in living men. Trees supposed to give rain and sunshine. First then, trees or tree spirits believed to give rain and sunshine. When the missionary Jerome of Prague was persuading the heathen Lithuanians to fell their sacred groves, a multitude of women besought the Prince of Lithuania to stop him, saying that with the woods he was destroying the house of God from which they had been wont to get rain and sunshine. The Mandaras in Assam think that if a tree in the sacred grove is felled, the sylvan gods invite their displeasure by withholding rain. In order to procure rain, the inhabitants of Monyo, a village in the Sergian district of Upper Burma, chose the largest tamarind tree near the village and named it in the haunt of the spirit, Nat, who controls the rain. When they offered bread, coconuts, plantains, and fowls to the guardian spirit of the village and to the spirit who gives rain, and they prayed, "O Lord, Nat, have pity on us poor mortals, and stay not the rain, inasmuch as their offering is given ungrudgingly. Let the rain fall day and night." Afterwards libations were made in honour of the spirit of the tamarind tree, and still later 3 elderly women, dressed in fine clothes and wearing necklaces and earrings, sang the rain song. In Cambodia, each village or province has its sacred tree, the abode of a spirit. If the rains are late, the people sacrifice to the tree. In time of drought, the elders of the Wakamba in East Africa assemble and take the calabash of cider and a goat to a baobab tree, where they kill the goat but do not eat it. When November women go out to sow corn, they take with them in their basket of seed 2 green branches of a particular kind of tree, Peltophorum africanum sond, one of which they plant in the field along with the first seed sown. The branch is believed to have the power of attracting rain. Hence, in one of the native dialects, the tree goes by the name of the rain bush. To extort rain from the tree's spirit, a branch is sometimes dipped in water, as we have seen above. In such cases, the spirit is doubtless supposed to be immanent in the branch, and the water thus applied to the spirit produces rain by a sort of sympathetic magic, exactly as we saw that in New Caledonia the rainmakers pour water on a skeleton, believing that the soul of the deceased will convert the water into rain. There is hardly room to doubt that Manhart is right in explaining as a rain charm the European custom of drenching with water the trees which are cut at certain popular festivals as Midsummer, Whitsuntide, and Harvest. Tree spirits supposed to make the crops grow. Again, tree spirits make the crops grow. Amongst the Mandaras, every village has its sacred grove, and the grove deities are held responsible for the crops, and are especially honoured at all the great agricultural festivals. The Negroes of the Gold Coast are in the habit of sacrificing at the foot of certain tall trees. They think that if one of these were felled, all the fruits of the earth would perish. Before harvest, the Wabunde of East Africa sacrifice a goat to the spirit that lives in baobab trees. The blood is poured into a hole at the foot of one of the trees. If the sacrifice were omitted, the spirit would send disease and death among the people. The galas dance in couples around sacred trees, praying for a good harvest. Every couple consists of a man and a woman, who are linked together by a stick, of which each holds one end. Under their arms they carry green corn or grass. Swedish peasants stick a leafy branch in each furrow of their cornfields, believing that this will ensure an abundant crop. The Harvest May. The same idea comes out in the German and French custom of the Harvest May. This is a large branch or a whole tree which is decked with ears of corn, brought home in a last wagon from the harvest field, and fastened on the roof of the farmhouse or of the barn, where it remains for a year. Manhart has proved that this branch or tree embodies the tree spirit conceived as the spirit of vegetation in general, whose vivifying and fructifying influence is thus brought to bear upon the corn in particular. As in Swabia, the Harvest May is fastened amongst the last stalks of corn left standing on the field,
and the vast sheaf is cut attached to its trunk.
The Harvest May of Germany has its counterpart in the Heroines of ancient Greece. The Eirson was a branch of olive or laurel, bound about with ribbons and hung with a variety of fruits. This branch was carried in procession at a harvest festival and was fastened over the door of the house, where it remained for a year. The object of preserving the Harvest May, or the Heroine for a year, is that the life-giving virtue of the bough may foster the growth of the crops throughout the year. By the end of the year, the virtue of the bough is supposed to be exhausted, and it is replaced by a new one. Following a similar train of thought, some of the Dyaks as Sarawak are careful at the rice harvest to take up the roots of a certain bulbous plant,
which bears a beautiful crown of white and fragrant flowers.
These roots are preserved with the rice in the granary and are planted again with the rice seed in the following season. The Dyaks say that the rice will not grow unless a plant of this sort be in the field. Customs like the Harvest May in India and Africa. Customs like that of the Harvest May appear to exist in India and Africa. At a harvest festival of the Lasai in southeast India, the chief goes with his people into the forest and fells a large tree, which is then carried into the village and set up in the midst. Sacrifice is offered, and spirits and rice are poured over the tree. The ceremony closes with a feast and a dance, at which the unmarried men and girls are the only performers. Among the Bechuanas, blackthorn is very sacred, and it would be a serious offence to cut a bough from it and carry it into the village during the rainy season. When the corn is ripe in the ear, people go with axes, and each man brings home a branch of the sacred hackthorn, with which they repair the village cattle yard. According to another authority, it is a rule with the Bechuanas that neither the hookthorn nor the milk tree must be cut down while the corn is on the ground, for this they think will prevent rain. When I was at Lataku, though Mr. Hamilton stood in much need of some milk tree timber, he durst not supply himself till all the corn was gathered in. Many tribes of the southeastern Africa will not cut down timber while the corn is green, fearing that if they did so, the crops would be destroyed by blight, hail, or early frost. The heathen Cheremiss in the Russian government of Kazan will not fell trees, mow grass, or dig the ground while the corn is in bloom. Again, the fructifying power of the tree is put forth at seed time as well as at harvest. Among the Aryan tribes of Gilgit, on the northwestern frontier of India, the sacred tree is the chili, a species of cedar, Juniperus excelsior. At the beginning of wheat sowing, the people receive from the Raja's granary a quantity of wheat, which is placed in a skin mixed with sprigs of the sacred cedar. A large bonfire of the cedar wood is lighted, and the wheat which is to be sown is held over the smoke. The rest is ground and made into a large cake, which is baked on the same fire and given to the ploughman. Here the intention of fertilizing the seed by means of the sacred cedar is unmistakable. Fertilizing virtue attributed to trees. In all these cases, the power of fostering the growth of crops, and in general, of cultivated plants, is ascribed to trees. The ascription is not unnatural, for the tree is the largest and most powerful member of the vegetable kingdom, and man is familiar with it before he takes to cultivating corn. Hence he naturally places the feebler, and to him, newer plant under the dominion of the older and more powerful. tree spirits making herds to multiply and women to bring forth. Again, the tree spirit makes the herds to multiply and blesses women with offspring. The sacred chili, or cedar of Gilgit, was supposed to possess this virtue in addition to that of fertilizing the corn. At the commencement of wheat sowing, 3 chosen unmarried youths, after undergoing daily washing and purification for 3 days, used to start for the mountain where the cedars grew, taking with them wine, oil, bread, and fruit of every kind. Having found a suitable tree, they sprinkled the wine and oil on it, while they ate the bread and fruit as a sacrificial feast. And they cut off the branch and brought it to the village, where amid general rejoicing it was placed on a large stone beside running water. A goat was then sacrificed, its blood poured over the cedar branch, and a wild dance took place, in which weapons were brandished about, and the head of the slaughtered goat was borne aloft, at which it was set up as a mark for arrows and bullet practice. Every good shot was rewarded with a gourd full of wine and some of the flesh of the goat. When the flesh was finished, the bones were thrown into the stream and a general ablution took place, after which every man went to his house, taking with him a spray of the cedar. On arrival at his house, he found the door shut in his face, and on his knocking for admission, his wife asked, "What have you brought?" To which he answered, "If you want children, I have brought them to you. If you want food, I have brought it. If you want cattle, I have brought them. Whatever you want, I have it." The door was then opened, and he entered with his cedar spray. The wife then took some of the leaves and poured wine and water in them, placed them on the fire, and the rest was sprinkled with flour and suspended from the ceiling. She then sprinkled flour on her husband's head and shoulders and addressed him thus: "I, Shiri Bagathun, son of the fairies, you have come from afar." Shiri Bagathun, the dreadful king, being of address to the cedar when praying for wants to be fulfilled. The next day the wife baked a number of cakes, and taking them with her, drove the family goats to the chili stone. When they were collected round the stone, she began to pelt them with pebbles, invoking the chili at the same time. According to the direction in which the goats ran off, omens were drawn as to the number and sex of the kids expected during the ensuing year. Walnuts and pomegranates were then placed on the chili stone. The cakes were distributed and eaten, and the goats followed to pasture in whatever direction they showed disposition to go. For 5 days afterwards, this song was sung in all the houses. "Dread fairy king, I sacrifice before you. How nobly do you stand. You have filled up my house. You have brought me a wife when I had not one. Instead of daughters, you have given me sons. You have shown me the way of right. You have given me many children." Fertilizing virtue attributed to trees. Here the driving of the goats to the stone on which the cedar had been placed is clearly meant to impart to them the fertilizing influence of the cedar. In northern India, the Emblica officinalis is a sacred tree. On the 11th of the month Falgun, February, libations are poured at the foot of the tree, a red or yellow string is bound about the trunk, and prayers are offered to it for the fruitfulness of women, animals and crops. Again, in northern India, the coconut is esteemed one of the most sacred fruits, and is called Srifala, or the fruit of Sri, the goddess of prosperity. It is the symbol of fertility, and all through Upper India is kept in shrines and presented by the priest to women who desire to become mothers. In the town of Kwa, near Old Calabar, there used to grow a palm tree which ensured conception to any barren woman who ate a nut from its branches. Influence of May trees on cattle. In Europe, the May tree or maypole is apparently supposed to possess similar powers over both women and cattle. Thus, in some parts of Germany, on the 1st of May, the peasants set up May trees or May bushes at the doors of stables and byres, one for each horse and cow. It is thought to make the cows yield much milk. Of the Irish, we are told that they fancy a green bough of a tree fastened on May Day against the house will produce plenty of milk that summer. In Suffolk, there was an old custom observed in most farmhouses that any servant who could bring in a branch of hawthorn in blossom on the 1st of May was entitled to a dish of cream for breakfast. Similarly, in parts of Cornwall, till certainly 10 years ago, any child who brought to a dairy on May morning a piece of hawthorn in bloom or a piece of fresh bracken long enough to surround the earthenware bowl in which cream is kept was given a bowl of cream. On May Day, English milkmaids used to dance with garlands on their pails. One May morning, long ago, Pepys, on his way to Westminster, saw many of them dancing, thus to the music of a fiddle, while pretty Nell Gwyn in her smock sleeves and bodice, watched them from the door of her lodgings in Drury Lane. May tree or May bush, a protection against witchcraft. However, in these and similar European customs, it seems that the influence of the tree, bush or bough is really protective rather than generative. It does not so much fill the udders of the cows as prevent them from being drained dry by witches who ride on broomsticks or pitchforks through the air on the eve of May Day, the famous Wild Night, and make great efforts to steal the milk from the cattle. Hence the many precautions which the prudent herdsman must take to guard his beasts at the season from the raids of these powerful creatures. For example, on May morning the Irish scatter primroses on the threshold, keep a piece of red-hot iron on the hearth, or twine branches of whitethorn and mountain ash or rowan about the door. Precautions against witchcraft on May Day. To save the milk they cut and peel boughs of mountain ash, rowan, and bind the twigs around the milk pails and the churn. According to a writer of the 16th century, whose description is quoted by Camden, the Irish account every woman who fetches fire on May Day a witch, nor will they give it to any but sick persons, and that with an imprecation, believing she will steal all the butter the next summer. On May Day they kill the hares they find among their cattle, supposing them the old woman who have designs on the butter. They imagine the butter so stolen may be recovered if they take some of the thatch hanging over the door and burn it. In the northeast of Scotland, pieces of rowan tree and woodbine, or a rowan alone, used to be placed over the doors of the cowhouses on May Day to keep the witches from their killing. And a still better way of attaining the same object was to tie a cross of rowan tree wound with a scarlet thread to each animal's tail. The Highlanders of Scotland believe that on Beltane Eve, that is, the night before May Day, the witches go about in the shape of hares and suck the milk from the cows. To guard against their depredations, tar was put behind the ears of the cattle and at the root of the tail, and the house was hung with rowan tree. For the same reason the Highlanders say that the peg of the cow saddle and the handle and cross of the churn staff should always be made of rowan, because that is the most potent charm against witchcraft. In the Isle of Man on May Day, old style, people carried crosses of rowan in their hats and fastened mayflowers over their doors as a protection against elves and witches, and for the same purpose they tied crosses of rowan to the tails of the cattle. Also, women washed their faces in the dew early on May morning in order to secure good luck, a fine complexion, and immunity from witches. Further, the break of day on the morning was a signal for setting the ling or gorse on fire, which was done for the sake of burning out the witches, who were wont to take the shape of hares. In some places indeed, as in the Lezaire parish, the practice was to burn gorse in the hedge of every field to drive away the witches, who were still feared in the Isle of Man. In Norway and Denmark, branches of rowan are similarly used to protect houses and cattle stalls against witches on Walpurgis Night, and there too it is thought that the churn staff should be made of rowan. In Germany, a common way of keeping witches from the cattle on Walpurgis Night is to chalk up 3 crosses on the door of the cowhouse. Branches of buckthorn stuck in the muck heaps on the eve of May Day answer the same purpose. In Silesia, the precautions taken at this season against witches are many and various. For example, pieces of buckthorn are nailed crosswise over the door of the cowhouse. Pitchforks and harrows turned upside down, with the prongs pointing outwards, are placed at the doors, and a sort of fresh turf from a meadow is laid before the threshold and strewed with marsh marigolds. Before the witches can pass the threshold, they must count every blade of grass in the turf and every petal of the marigolds, and while they are still counting, the day breaks and the power is gone. For the same reason, the little birch trees are set up at the house door, because the witches cannot enter the house till they have counted all the leaves, and before they have done the sum it is broad daylight, and they must flee away with the shadows. On Walpurgis Night, the Germans of Moravia put knives under the threshold of the cowhouse and twigs of birch at the door and in the muck heap to keep the witches from the cows. For the same purpose, the Bohemians at this season lay branches of gooseberry bushes, hawthorn and wild rose trees on the thresholds of the cowhouses, because the witches are caught by the thorns and can get no farther. We now see why thorny trees and bushes, whether hawthorn, buckthorn, or whatnot, afford protection against witchcraft. They serve as prickly hedges through which the witches cannot force their way. But this explanation clearly does not apply to the mountain ash and the birch. Influence of tree spirits on cattle among the Wends, Estonians, and Caucasians. On the 2nd of July, some of the Wends used to set up an oak tree in the middle of the village with an iron cock fastened to its top. Then they danced round it and drove the cattle round it to make them thrive. Some of the Estonians believe in a mischievous spirit called mythical, who lives in the forest and has the wheel of the cattle in his hands. Every year a new image of him is prepared. On an appointed day, all the villagers assemble and make a straw man, dress him in clothes, and take him to the common pasture land of the village. Here the figure is fastened to a high tree, round which the people dance noisily. Almost every day of the year, prayer and sacrifice are offered to him that he may protect the cattle. Sometimes the image of Metesk is made of a corn sheaf and fastened to a tall tree in the wood. The people perform strange antics before it to induce Metesk to guard the corn and the cattle. The Circassians regard the pear tree as a protector of cattle, so they cut down a young pear tree in the forest, branch it and carry it home, where it is adored as a divinity. Almost every house has one such pear tree. In autumn, on the day of the festival, the tree is carried into the house with great ceremony to the sound of music, and amid the joyous cries of all the inmates, who compliment it on its fortunate arrival. It is covered with candles, and a cheese is fastened to its top. Round about it they eat, drink and sing. Then they bid the tree goodbye and take it back to the courtyard, where it remains for the rest of the year, set up against the wall without receiving any mark of respect. Tree spirits grant offspring or an easy delivery to women. In the Bough tribe of Maoris, the power of making women fruitful is ascribed to trees. These trees are associated with the navel strings of definite mythical ancestors, as indeed the navel strings of all children used to be hung upon them down to quite recent times. A barren woman had to embrace such a tree with her arms, and she received a male or a female child according as she embraced the east or the west side. The common European custom of placing a green bush on May Day before or on the house of a beloved maiden probably originated in the belief for the fertilizing power of the tree spirit. In some parts of Bavaria, such bushes are set up also at the homes of newly married pairs, and the practice is only omitted if the wife is near her confinement, for in that case they say that the husband has set up a May bush for himself. Among the South Slavonians, a barren woman who desires to have a child places a new chemise upon a fruitful tree on the eve of St. George's Day. Next morning before sunrise, she examines the garment, and if she finds that some living creature has crept on it, she hopes that her wish will be fulfilled within a year. Then she puts on the chemise, confident that she will be fruitful as the tree on which the garment has passed the night. Among the Karakas, barren women roll themselves on the ground under a solitary apple tree in order to obtain offspring. Some of the hill tribes of India have a custom of marrying the bride and bridegroom to two trees before they are married to each other. For example, among the Mundas, the bride touches with red lead the mahar tree, clasps it in her hands, and is tied to it, and the bridegroom goes through a like ceremony with the mango tree. The intention of the custom may perhaps be to communicate to the newly wedded pair the vigorous reproductive power of the trees. Power of trees to grant women an easy delivery. Lastly, the power of granting to women an easy delivery at childbirth is ascribed to trees both in Sweden and Africa. In some districts of Sweden there was formerly a bartrad or guardian tree, lime asherum, in the neighbourhood of every farm. No one would pluck a single leaf off the sacred tree, any injury to which was punished by ill luck or sickness. Pregnant women used to clasp the tree in their arms in order to ensure an easy delivery. In some Negro tribes of the Congo region, pregnant women make themselves garments out of the bark of a certain sacred tree, because they believe that this tree delivers them from the dangers that attend childbearing. The story that Leto clasped a palm tree and an olive tree or two laurel trees when she was about to give birth to the divine twins Apollo and Artemis perhaps points to a similar Greek belief in the efficiency of certain trees to facilitate delivery. End of section 3. Section 4, Chapter 10, Relics of Tree Worship in Modern Europe. May trees in Europe. From the foregoing review of the beneficial qualities commonly ascribed to tree spirits, it is easy to understand why customs like the May tree or the maypole have prevailed so widely and figured so prominently in the popular festivals of European peasants. In spring or early summer, or even on Midsummer Day, it was and still is in many parts of Europe the custom to go out to the woods, cut down a tree and bring it into the village, where it is set up amid general rejoices, or the people cut branches in the woods and fasten them on every house. The intention of these customs is to bring home to the village, and to each house, the blessings which the tree spirit has in its power to bestow. Hence the custom in some places of planting a May tree before every house, or of carrying the village May tree from door to door, that every household may receive its share of the blessing. Out of the mass of evidence on the subject, a few examples may be selected. May trees and May bushes in England. Sir Henry Piers, in his description of Westmeath, writing in 1682, says, "On May Eve every family sets up before their door a green bush, strewed over with yellow flowers which the meadows yield plentifully. In countries where timber is plentiful, they erect tall slender trees which stand high, and they continue almost the whole year, so as a stranger would go nigh to imagine that they were all signs of ale cellars, and that all houses were ale houses. In Northamptonshire, a young tree 10 or 12 feet high used to be planted before each house on May Day, so as to appear growing. Flowers were thrown over it and strewn about the door. Among ancient customs still retained by the Cornish may be reckoned that of decking their doors and porches on the 1st of May with green boughs of sycamore and hawthorn, and of planting trees or other stumps of trees before their houses." May garlands in England. In the north of England it was formerly the custom for young people to rise little after midnight on the morning of the 1st of May, and go out with music and the blowing of horns into the woods, where they broke branches and adorned them with nosegays and crowns of flowers. This done, they returned about sunrise and fastened the flower-decked branches over the doors and windows of their houses. At Abingdon, in Berkshire, young people formerly went about in groups on May morning, singing a carol of which the following are two of the verses. "We have been rambling all the night, and some time of this day. Now returning back again, we bring a garland gay. A garland gay we bring you here, and at your door we stand. Here's a sprout well budded out, the work of our Lord's hand."
At the towns of Saffron Walden and Debden in Essex, on the 1st of May, little girls go about in parties from door to door, singing a song almost identical with the above and carrying garlands. A doll dressed in white is usually placed in the middle of each garland. Similar customs have been and indeed are still observed in various parts of England. The garlands are generally in the form of hoops intersecting each other at right angles. Thus on May morning the girls of the neighbouring villages used to flock into Northampton bringing their garlands, which they exhibited from house to house. The skeleton of the garland was formed of 2 hoops of osier or hazel crossing each other at right angles, and so twinned with flowers and ribbons that no part of them could be seen. In the centre of the garlands were placed gaily dressed dolls, 1, 2 or 3 in number according to the size of the garland. The whole was fixed to a staff about 5 feet long by which it was carried. In showing their garlands, the children chanted some simple ditties and received in return pennies, which furnished forth the feast on their return to their homes. A merry dance round the garland concluded the festivity. At Exeter, groups of children carried garlands of flowers about the town on May Day. The garlands consist of 2 hoops, one passing through the other, which give the appearance of 4 half circles, and they are decorated with flowers and evergreens and surmounted with a bunch of flowers as a sort of crown, and in the centre of the hoops is a pendant orange and flowers. One or more of the children carry a little pole or stick upright with a bunch of flowers fastened to the top. They are themselves decorated with flowers and ribbons, and receive pence from the house which they visit. At Watford and Hertfordshire, groups of children, almost entirely girls, go about the streets from door to door on May Day singing some verses, of which 2 agree almost verbally with those which, as we have seen, are sung at Abingdon and Berkshire. They are dressed in white and adorned with grey ribbons and sashes of many hues. 2 of the girls carry between them, on a stick, what they call the garland, which in its simplest form is made of 2 circular hoops intersecting each other at right angles. A more elaborate form has, in addition, smaller semicircles inserted in the 4 angles formed by the meeting of the hoops at the top of the garland. These hoops are covered with any wildflowers in season,
and are further ornamented with ribbons. The garland in shape reminds me of the Christmas, which used to form the centre of the Christmas decorations at Yorkshire some few years ago, except the latter had a bunch of mistletoe inside the hoops. A similar custom was observed at Bampton or in the bush in Oxfordshire, down to about the middle of the 19th century. The garland consists of 2 crossed hoops covered with moss, flowers and ribbons. 2 girls, known as a lady and her maid, bore the garland between them on a stick, and a boy called the Lord, who carried a stick dressed with ribbons and flowers, collected contributions from the spectators. From time to time the lady sang a few lines and was then kissed by the Lord. At Sevenoaks in Kent, the children carry boughs and garlands from door to door on May Day. The boughs consist of 6 carried upright with bunches of leaves and wildflowers fastened to the top. The garlands are formed of 2 hoops interlaced crosswise and covered with blue and yellow flowers from the wooden hedges. Sometimes the garlands are fastened to the end of the stick, carried perpendicularly. Sometimes they hang from the middle of the stick, borne horizontally by 2 children. In the streets of Cambridge, little girls regularly make their appearance every May Day with female dolls enclosed in hoops, which are covered with ribbons and flowers.
These they show to passers-by, inviting them to remember the May Lady by paying a small sum to her bearers.
At Salisbury, girls go through the streets on May Day in pairs, carrying between them on a stick a circular garland or hoop adorned with flowers and bows. They visit the shops asking for money. A similar custom is observed at Wilton, a few miles from Salisbury. At Cawthorne in Yorkshire, on the 1st of May, the school children came with hoops to beg for artificial flowers. These my mother's maid used to sew on to the hoops, which with ribbons and other decorations were used in decking out a tall maypole planted in the village. It appears that a hoop wreathed with rowan and marsh marigold, and bearing suspended within it 2 balls, is still carried on May Day by villagers in some parts of Ireland. The balls, which are sometimes covered with gold and silver paper, are said to have originally represented the sun and moon.
May customs in France, Germany and Greece.
In some villages of the Vosges Mountains, on the first Sunday of May, young girls go in bands from house to house, singing a song in praise of May, in which mention is made of the bread and meal that come in May. If money is given them, they fasten a green bough to the door. If it is refused, they wish the family many children and no bread to feed them. In the French department of Mayenne, boys who bore the name of Mélotonins used to go about from farm to farm on the 1st of May, singing carols, for which they received money or a drink. They plant a small tree or a branch of a tree among the Germans of Moravia on the 3rd Sunday before Easter, which goes by the name of Later Sunday. It is customary in some places for young girls to carry a small fir tree from door to door while they sing songs, for which they receive presents. The tree is tricked out with many-coloured ribbons and sometimes with flowers and dyed eggshells, and its branches are twined together so as to form what is called a crown. In Corfu, the children go about singing May songs on the 1st of May. The boys carry small cypresses adorned with ribbons, flowers, and the fruits of the season. They receive a glass of wine at each house. The girls carry nosegays. One of them is dressed up like an angel with gilt wings and scatters flowers. Whitsuntide customs in Russia. On the Thursday before Whitsunday, the Russian villagers go out into the woods, sing songs, weave garlands and cut down a young birch tree, which they dress up in women's clothes or adorn with many-coloured threads and ribbons. After that comes a feast, at the end of which they take the dressed-up birch tree, carry it home to their village with joyful dance and song, and set it up with one of the houses, where it remains as an honoured guest till Whitsunday. On the 2 intervening days, they pay visits to the house where their guest is, but on the 3rd day, Whitsunday, they take her to a stream and fling her into its waters, throwing their garlands after her. All over Russia, every village and every town is turned, a little before Whitsunday, into a sort of garden. Everywhere along the streets, young birch trees stand in rows. Every house and every room is adorned with boughs. Even the engines upon the railway are for the time decked with green leaves. In this Russian custom, the dressing of the birch in women's clothes shows how clearly the tree is personified, and the throwing it into a stream is most probably a rain charm. In some villages of Altmark, it was formerly the custom for serving men, grooms, cowherds to go from farm to farm at Whitsuntide, distributing crowns made of birch branches and flowers to the farmers. These crowns are hung up in the houses and left to the following year. May trees in Germany and Sweden. In the neighborhood of Zabern, in Alsace, bands of people go about carrying May trees. Amongst them is a man dressed in a white shirt and his face blackened. In front of him is carried a large May tree, but each member of the band also carries a smaller one. One of the company bears a huge basket in which he collects eggs, bacon, and so forth. In some parts of Sweden, on the eve of May Day, leads go about carrying each a branch of fresh gathered birch twigs, wholly or partially in a leaf. With a village fiddler at their head, they make the round of the houses singing May songs. The burden of their songs is a prayer for fine weather, a plentiful harvest, and worldly and spiritual blessings. One of them carries a basket in which he collects gifts of eggs and the like. If they are well received, they stick a leafy twig in the roof over the cottage door. Midsummer trees and poles in Sweden. But in Sweden, midsummer is the season when these ceremonies are chiefly observed. On the eve of St. John, the 23rd of June, the houses are thoroughly cleansed and garnished with green boughs and flowers. Young fir trees are raised at the doorway and elsewhere about the homestead, and very often small umbrageous arbours are constructed in the garden. In Stockholm on this day a leaf market is held at which thousands of maypoles, majstanger, from 6 inches to 12 feet high, decorated with leaves, flowers, sips of coloured paper, gilt, eggshells strung on reeds and so on, are exposed for sale. Bonfires are lit on the hills and the people dance around them and jump over them. But the chief event of the day is setting up the maypole. This consists of a straight and dull spruce pine tree stripped of its branches, at times hoops, and at others pieces of wood placed crosswise are attached to it at intervals, whilst at others it is provided with bows, representing, so as to say, a man with his arms akimbo. From top to bottom, not only the majstang, maypole itself, but the hoops, bows, etc. are ornamented with leaves, flowers, slips of various cloth, gilt, eggshells, etc., and on top of it is a large vane, or it may be a flag. The raising of the maypole, the decoration of which is done by the village maidens, is an affair of much ceremony. The people flock to it from all quarters and dance round it in a great ring. Midsummer customs of the same sort used to be observed in some parts of Germany. Thus in the towns of the upper Harz mountains, tall fir trees with the bark peeled off their lower trunks were set up in open places and decked with flowers and eggs, which were painted yellow and red. Round these trees the young folk danced by day and the old folk in the evening. Many people disguised themselves and dramatic representations were given, amongst others mock executions, at which the sufferer's hat was knocked off instead of his head. At the village of Lurbach, in these fir-clad mountains, children will gather together on midsummer day, each with a tiny fir tree, which they made to revolve from left to right, in the direction of the sun, while they sang, "The maiden turned herself about," or "O thou dear summertime, O thou dear summertime." In some parts of Bohemia, also a maypole or midsummer tree is erected on St. John's Eve. The lads fetch a tall fir or pine from the wood and set it up on a height where the girls deck it with nosegays, garlands, and red ribbons. It is afterwards burned. Village maypoles in England. It would be needless to illustrate at length the custom which has prevailed in various parts of Europe, such as England, France, and Germany, of setting up a village May tree or maypole on May Day. A few examples will suffice. The puritanical writer Philip Stubbs, in his Anatomy of Abuses, first published at London in 1583, has described with manifest disgust how they used to bring in the maypole in the days of good Queen Bess. His description affords us a vivid glimpse of merry England in the olden time. Against May, Whitsunday or other time, all the young men and maidens, old men and wives, run gadding overnight to the woods, groves, hills and mountains, where they spend all the night in pleasant pastimes, and in the morning they return, bring with them birch and branches of trees to deck their assemblies withal. And no marvel, for there is a great lord present amongst them, a superintendent and lord over the pastimes and sports, namely Sothing, Prince of Hell. But the chiefest jewel they bring from thence is their maypole, which they bring home with great veneration, and it's thus. Bringing in the maypole. They have 20 or 40 yoke of oxen, every ox having a sweet nosegay of flowers placed on the tip of his horns, and these oxen draw home this maypole, this stinking idol rather, which is covered all over with flowers and herbs, bound round about with strings from the top to the bottom, and sometimes painted with variable colours, with 200 or 300 men, women and children following it in great devotion. and thus being reared up with handkerchiefs and flags hovering on the top. They straw the ground round about, bind green boughs about it, set up summer halls, bowers, and arbours hard by it, and then fall they to dance about it, like as the heathen people did at the dedication of the idols, whereof this is a perfect pattern, or rather the thing itself. I have heard it credibly reported, and that viva voce, by men of great gravity and reputation, that of 40, 60, or 300 maids going to the wood overnight,
there have scarcely the third part of them returned home again undefiled.
Of the Cornish people, their historian Bourdelais says, from towns they make excursions, on May Eve, into the country, cut down a tall elm, bring it into towns with rejoices,
and having fitted a straight taper pole to the end of it, and painted it, erected it in the most public part, and upon holidays and festivals, dress it with garlands of flowers or ensigns and streamers.
In Northumberland, down apparently to near the end of the 18th century, young people of both sexes used to go out early in May morning to gather the flowering thorn and dew off the grass, which they brought home with music and acclamations. Then, having dressed a pole on the green with garlands, they danced about it. The dew was considered as a great cosmetic, and preserved the face from wrinkles, blotches, and the traces of old age. A syllabub made of warm milk from the cow, sweet cakes and wine was preferred for the feast, and a kind of divination to discover who should be wedded first was practised by dropping a marriage ring into the syllabub and fishing for it with a ladle. At Padstow in Cornwall, when shipbuilding was a thriving industry of the port, the shipwrights used to erect a tall maypole at the top of Cross Street in the middle of a cross inlaid with stone. The pole was gaily decorated with spring flowers and so forth, but the custom has long been abandoned. A great feature of the celebration of May Day in Padstow used to be the hobby horse, that is, a man wearing a ferocious mask who went dancing and singing before the chief houses, accompanied by a great flower-bedecked crowd of men and women, while the men fired pistols loaded with powder in all directions.
Village May trees and maypoles in Germany. In Swabia on the 1st of May, a tall fir tree used to be fetched into the village, where it was decked with ribbons and set up. Then the people danced round it merrily to music. The tree stood in the village green the whole year through until a fresh tree was brought in next day. In Saxony, people were not content with bringing the summer symbolically, as king or queen, into the village. They brought the fresh green itself from the woods even into the houses. That is, the May or Whitsuntide trees, which are mentioned in documents from the 13th century onwards. The fetching in of the May tree was also a festival. The people went out to the woods to seek the May, Majan Quarerir, brought young trees, especially firs and birches, to the village and set them up before the doors of the houses, or of the cattle stalls, or in the rooms. Young fellows erected such May trees, as we have already said, before the chambers of their sweethearts. Beside these household Mays, a great May tree or maypole, which had also been brought in solemn procession to the village, was set up in the middle of the village or in the marketplace of the town. It had been chosen by the whole community, who watched over it most carefully. Generally the tree was stripped of its branches and leaves, nothing but the crown being left, on which were displayed, in addition to many coloured ribbons and cloths, a variety of victuals such as sausages, cakes and eggs. The young folk exerted themselves to obtain these prizes. In the greasy poles which are still to be seen at our fairs, we have a relic of these old maypoles. Maypoles and May trees in Germany and France. Not uncommonly, there was a race on foot or on horseback to the May tree, a Whitsuntide pastime, in which, in course of time, has been divested of its goal and survives a popular custom to this day in many parts of Germany. In the great towns of our land, the custom has developed into sport, for our spring races are in their origin nothing but the old German horse races, in which the victor received a prize, generally a red cloth, from the hand of a maiden, while the last rider was greeted with jeers and jibes by the assembled community. The custom of the May tree is observed by the Wends of Saxony as well as by the Germans. The young men of the village choose the slimmest and tallest tree in the wood, peel it and set it up on the village green. Its leafy top is decked with cloths and ribbons presented by the girls. Here it stands, towering high above the roofs, till Ascension Day, or in many places till Whitsuntide. When it has been taken down, the young folk dance round it, and the youth who catches and breaks off the leafy crown of the falling tree is a hero of the day. Holding the green boughs aloft, he is carried shoulder high, with music and joyous shouts, to the alehouse, where the dance is resumed. At Bordeaux, on the 1st of May, the boys of each street used to erect in it a maypole, which they adorned with garlands,
and a great crown. And every evening during the whole of the month, the young people of both sexes dance singing about the pole. Down to the present day, May trees decked with flowers and ribbons are set up on May Day in every village and hamlet of Gay Province. Under them, the young folk make merry and the old folk rest. Maypoles among the Karens of Burma. The Red Karens of Upper Burma hold a festival in April at which the chief ceremony is the erection of a post on ground set apart for the purpose in or near each village. A new post is set up every year. The old ones are left standing but are not renewed if they fall or decay. Omens are first drawn from chicken bones as to which tree will be the best to fell for the post, which day will be the luckiest, and so on. A pole some 20 or 30 feet long is then hewn from the tree and ornamented with a brutally carved capital. On the lucky day, all the villagers assemble and drag the pole to the chosen spot. When it has been set up, the people dance a rude sort of maypole dance to the music of drums and gongs. Much pork is eaten and much liquor drunk on this festive occasion. Permanent maypoles. In all these cases, apparently the custom is or was to bring in a new May tree each year. However, in England, the village maypole seems, as a rule, at least in latter times, to have been permanent, not renewed annually. Villagers of Upper Bavaria renew their maypole once every 3, 4 or 5 years. It is a fir tree fetched from the forest, and amid all the wreaths, flags and inscriptions with which it is bedecked, an essential part is the bunch of dark green foliage left at the top as memento that it we have to do, not with a dead pole, but with a living tree from the green wood. We can hardly doubt that originally the practice everywhere was to set up a new May tree every year, as the object of the custom was to bring in the fructifying spirit of vegetation, newly awakened in spring. The end would have been defeated if, instead of a living tree, green and sappy, an old withered one had been erected year after year or allowed to stand permanently. When, however, the meaning of the custom had been forgotten, and the May tree was regarded simply as a centre for holiday merrymaking, people saw no reason for felling a fresh tree every year, and preferred to let the same tree stand permanently, only decking it with fresh flowers on May Day. But even when the main pole had thus become a fixture, the need of giving it the appearance of being a green tree, not a dead pole, was sometimes felt. Thus at Wevenham in Cheshire are 2 maypoles, which are decorated on this day, May Day, with all due attention to the ancient solemnity. The sides are hung with garlands, and the top terminated by a birch or other tall centre tree with its leaves on. The bark being peeled and the stem spliced to the pole so as to give the appearance of one tree from the summit. Thus the renewal of the May tree is like the renewal of the harvest May. Each is intended to secure a fresh portion of the fertilizing spirit of vegetation and to preserve it throughout the year. But whereas the efficiency of the harvest May is restricted to promoting the growth of the crops, that the May tree or May branch extends also, as we have seen, to women and cattle. The May tree burnt at the end of the year. Lastly, it is worth noting that the old May tree is sometimes burned at the end of the year. Thus, in the district of Prague, young people break pieces of the public May tree and place them behind the holy pictures in their rooms, where they remain till the next May Day, and are then burned on the hearth. In Wittenberg, the bushes which are set up on the houses on Palm Sunday are sometimes left there for a year and then burnt. The Ire is sown. The harvest May of Greece was perhaps burnt at the end of the year. Tree spirit detached from the tree and represented in human form. So much for the tree spirit conceived as incorporate or immanent in the tree. We have now to show that the tree spirit is often conceived and represented as detached from the tree and clothed in human form, and even as embodied in living men or women. The evidence for this anthropomorphic representation of the tree spirit is largely to be found in the popular customs of European peasantry. These will be described presently, but before examining them we may notice an Estonian folktale which illustrates the same train of thought very clearly. Estonian story of a tree elf. Once upon a time, so runs the tale, a young peasant was busy raking the hay in a meadow, when on the rim of the horizon a heavy thundercloud loomed black and angry, warning him to make haste with his work before the storm should break. He finished in time and was wending his way homeward, when, under a tree, he espied a stranger fast asleep. He will be drenched to the skin, he thought, the good-natured young fellow to himself, if I allow him to sleep on. So he stepped up to the sleeper and shaking him forcibly roused him from his slumber. The stranger started up, and at sight of the thundercloud which now darkened the sky, he blenched, fumbled in his pockets, and finding nothing in them wherewith to reward the friendly swain, he said, "This time I am your debtor, but the time will come when I shall be able to repay your kindness. Remember what I tell you, you will enlist. You will be parted from your friends for years, and one day a feeling of homesickness will come over you in a foreign land. Then look up, and you will see a crooked birch tree a few steps from you. Go to it, knock thrice on the trunk, and ask, 'Is the crooked one at home?' The rest will follow." With these words, the stranger hastened away and was out of sight in a moment. The peasant also went his way, and soon forgot all about the matter. But time went by, and part of the stranger's prophecy came true, for the peasant turned soldier and served in a cavalry regiment for years. One day, when he was quartered with his regiment in the north of Finland, it fell to his turn to tend the horses while his comrades were roistering in the tavern. Suddenly a great yearning for home, such as he had never known before, came over the lonely trooper. Tears started to his eyes, and dear visions of his native land crowded on his soul. Then he bethought him of the sleeping stranger in the wood, and the whole scene came back to him as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He looked up, and there, strange to tell, he was aware of a crooked birch tree right in front of him. More than just then in earnest, he went up to it and did as the stranger had bidden him. Hardly had the words, "Is the crooked one at home?" passed his lips, when the stranger himself stood before him and said, "I am glad you have come. I feared you had forgotten me. You wish to be at home, do you not?" The trooper said, "Yes, he did." Then the crooked one cried into the tree, "Young folks, which of you is the fleetest?" A voice from the birch replied, "Father, I can run as fast as a moored hen flies." "Well, I need a fleeter message today," a second voice answered. "I can run like the wind." "I need a swifter envoy," said the father. Then the third voice cried, "I can run like the thought of man. You are after my own heart. Fill a bag full of gold and take it with my friend and benefactor to his home." Then he caught the soldier by the hat, crying, "The hat to the man, and the man to the house." The same moment the soldier felt his hat fly from his head. When he looked about for it, lo, he was at home in the old familiar parlour, wearing his old peasant clothes, and the great sack of money stood before him. Here on parade and at the roll call he was never missed. When the man who told his story was asked, "Who could the stranger be?" he answered, "Who but a tree elf?" Tree spirit represented simultaneously in vegetable and human form. There is an instructive class of cases in which the tree spirit is represented simultaneously in vegetable form and in human form, which are set side by side as if for the express purpose of explaining each other. In these cases, the human representative of the tree spirit is sometimes a doll or puppet, sometimes a living person, but whether a puppet or a person is placed beside a tree or bough, so that together the person or puppet and the tree or bough form a sort of bilingual inscription, the one being, so to speak, a translation of the other. Here, therefore, there is no room left for doubt that the spirit of the tree is actually represented in human form. Thus, in Bohemia, on the fourth Sunday in Lent, young people throw a puppet called Death into the water. Then the girls go into the wood, cut down a young tree, and fasten it to a puppet dressed in white clothes to look like a woman. With this tree and puppet, they go from house to house collecting gratitudes and singing songs with the refrain, "We carry death out of the village. We bring summer into the village." Here, as we shall see later on, the summer is the spirit of vegetation returning or reviving in spring. In some parts of our own country, children go about asking for pence, with some small imitations of maypoles, and with a finely dressed doll which they call the Lady of the May. In these cases, the tree and the puppet are obviously regarded as equivalent. The Little May Rose. At Thann in Alsace, a girl called the Little May Rose, dressed in white, carries a small May tree which is gay with garlands and ribbons. Her companions collect gifts from door to door, singing a song. Little May Rose, turn round 3 times, let us look at you round and round. Rose of the May, come to the green wood away, we will be merry all. So we go from the May to the roses. In the course of the song, a wish is expressed that those who give nothing may lose their fowls by the martin, that their vine may bear no clusters, their tree no nuts, their fields no corn. The produce of the year is supposed to depend on the gifts offered to these May singers. Here and in the case mentioned above, where children go about with green boughs or garlands on May Day, singing and collecting money, the meaning is that with the spirit of vegetation they bring plenty and good luck to the house, and they expect to be paid for the service. In Russian Lithuania, on the 1st of May, they used to set up a green tribe before the village, Then the rustic swains chose the prettiest girl, crowned her, swathed her in birch branches, and set her beside the May tree, where they danced, sang, and shouted, O May, O May. In Brie, Ile-de-France, a May tree is set up in the midst of the village. Its top is crowned with flowers. Lower down it is twined with leaves and twigs, still lower with huge green branches. The girls dance round it. At the same time, a lad wrapped in leaves and called Father May is led about. The Warburg. In the small towns of the Frankenwald Mountains in northern Bavaria, on the 2nd of May, a warble tree is erected before a tavern, and a man dances round it, enveloped in straw from head to foot in such a way that the ears of corn unite above his head to form a crown. He is called the Warburg, and used to be led in procession through the streets, which were adorned with sprigs of birch. Green George in Carinthia. Amongst the Slavs of Carinthia, on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April, the young people deck with flowers and garlands a tree which has been felled on the eve of the festival. The tree is then carried in procession, accompanied with music and joyful acclamations, the chief figure in the procession being the Green George, a young fellow clad from head to foot in green birch branches. At the close of the ceremonies, the Green George, that is an effigy of him, is thrown into the water. It is the aim of the lad who acts Green George to step out of his leafy envelope and substitute the effigy so adroitly that no one shall perceive the change. In many places, however, the lad himself who plays the part of Green George is ducked in a river or pond, and the express intention of thus ensuring rain to make the fields and meadows green in summer. In some places the cattle are crowned and driven from their stalls to the accompaniment of a song. Green George we bring, Green George we accompany, may he feed our herds well, if not to the water with him. Here we see that the same powers of making rain and fostering the cattle, which are ascribed to the tree spirit regarded as incomparate in the tree, are also attributed to the tree spirit represented by a living man. Green George among the Gypsies. Among the Gypsies of Transylvania and Romania, the festival of Green George is a chief celebration of spring. Some of them keep it on Easter Monday, others on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April. On the eve of the festival, a young willow tree is cut down, adorned with garlands and leaves, and set up in the ground. Women with child place one of their garments under the tree and leave it there overnight. If next morning they find a leaf of the tree lying on the garment, they know that their delivery will be easy. Sick and old people go to the tree in the evening, spit on it thrice and say, "You will soon die, but let us live." Next morning the gypsies gather about the willow. The chief figure of the festival is Green George, a lad who is concealed from top to toe in green leaves and blossoms. He throws a few handfuls of grass to the beasts of the tribe in order that they may have no lack of fodder throughout the year. Then he takes 3 iron nails, which have lain for 3 days and nights in water, and knocks them into the willow, after which he pulls them out and flings them into a running stream to propitiate the water spirits. Finally, a pretense is made of throwing Green George into the water, but in fact it is only a puppet made of branches and leaves which is ducked in the stream. In this version of the custom, the powers of granting an easy delivery to women and of communicating vital energy to the sick and old are clearly ascribed to the willow. With Green George, the human double of the tree bestows food on the cattle and further ensures a favour of the water spirits by putting them in indirect communication with the tree. Double representation of the tree spirit by tree and man among the Orangs. An example of the double representation of the spirit of vegetation by a tree and a living man is reported from Bengal. The Orangs have a festival in spring, while the sal trees are in blossom, because they think that at this time the marriage of earth is celebrated and the sal flowers are necessary for the ceremony. On the appointed day, the villagers go with their priests to the Sarna, the sacred grove, a remnant of the old sal forest in which a goddess Sarna, Buri, or woman of the grove, is supposed to dwell. She is thought to have great influence on the rain, and the priest arriving with his party at the grove sacrifices to her 5 fowls, of which a morsel is given to each person present. Then they gather the sal flowers and return laden with them to the village. Next day the priest visits every house, carrying the flowers in a wide open basket. The women of each house bring out water to wash his feet as he approaches, and kneeling, make him an obeisance. Then he dances with them and places some of the sal flowers over the door of the house and in the women's hair. No sooner is this done than the women empty their water jugs over him, drenching him to the skin. A feast follows, and the young people with sal flowers in their hair dance all night on the village green. Here the equivalence of the flower-bearing priest to the goddess of the flowering tree comes out plainly, for she is supposed to influence the rain, and the drenching of the priest with water is doubtless, like the ducking of the green George in Corinthia and elsewhere, a rain charm. Thus the priest, as if he were the tree goddess herself, goes from door to door dispensing rain and bestowing fruitfulness on each house, but especially on the women. Double representation of the harvest goddess Gauri by a bundle of plants and an unmarried girl. In some parts of India, the harvest goddess Gauri, the wife of Shiva, is represented both by an unmarried girl and by a bundle of the wild-flowering balsam plant touch-me-not, impatience sp, which is tied up in a mummy-like figure with a woman's mask, dress and ornaments. Before being removed from the soil to represent the goddess, the plants are worshipped. The girl is also worshipped. Then the bundle of plants is carried and the girl who personates the goddess walks through the rooms of the house while the supposed footprints of Gauri herself are imprinted on the floor with red paste. On entering each room, the human representative Gauri is asked, "Gauri, Gauri, whither have you come and what do you see?" And the girl makes appropriate replies. Then she is given a mouthful of sweets and the mistress of the house says, "Come with golden feet and stay forever." The plant-formed effigy of Gauri is afterwards worshipped as the goddess herself and receives offerings of rice cakes and pancakes. On the third day it is thrown into a river or tank. Then a handful of pebbles of sand is brought home from the spot and thrown all over the house and the trees to bring them luck to the house and to protect the trees from vermin. A remarkable feature of the ceremonies is that the goddess Gauri is supposed to be secretly followed by her husband Shiva, who remains hidden under the fold of a garment and is represented by a lotua, covered by a coconut and filled with rice, which is carefully measured. After the image of Gauri has been thrown into the river or tank, the rice of the lotta, representing Shiva, is carefully measured again in order to see whether the quantity has increased or decreased, and according to the result an abundant or a scanty harvest is prognosticated. Hence it appears that the whole ritual aims at ensuring a plentiful crop of rice. In this case, the spirit of vegetation thus represented is duplicate by a living girl, and the effigy of a woman is a harvest goddess, not a tree spirit, but the principle is the same. W. Manhart's summary of the evidence. Without citing more examples to the same effect, we may sum up the results of the preceding pages in the words of Manhart. The customs quoted suffice to establish with certainty the conclusion that in these spring processions, the spirit of vegetation is often represented both by the May tree and in addition by a man dressed in green leaves or flowers, or by a girl similarly adorned. It is the same spirit which animates the tree and is active in the inferior plants and which we have recognized in the May tree and the harvest May. Quite consistently, the spirit is also supposed to manifest his presence in the first flower of spring and reveals himself both in a girl representing a May rose and also as giver of harvest in the person of the Walber. The procession with this representative of the divinity was supposed to produce the same beneficial effect of the fowls, the fruit trees, and the crops as the presence of the deity himself. In other words, the mummer was regarded not as an image but as an actual representative of the spirit of vegetation. Hence the wish expressed by the attendants on the May rose and the May tree that those who refuse them gifts of eggs, bacon, and so forth may have no share in the blessings which it is in the power of the itinerant spirits to bestow. We may conclude that these begging processions with May trees or May boughs from door to door, bringing the May or the summer, had everywhere originally a serious and so to speak sacramental significance. People really believed that the god of growth was present unseen in the bough by the procession he was brought to each house to bestow his blessing. The names May, Father May, May Lady, Queen of the May, by which the anthropomorphic spirit of vegetation is denoted, show that the idea of the spirit of vegetation is bent with the personification of the season at which his powers are most strikingly manifested. Tree spirits or vegetation spirit represented by a person alone. Thus far we have seen that the tree spirit, or the spirit of vegetation in general, is represented either in vegetable form alone, as by a tree, bough or flower, or in vegetable and human form simultaneously, as by a tree, bough or flower, in combination with a puppet or a living person. It remains to show that representation of him by a tree, bough or flower is sometimes entirely dropped, while the representation of him by a living person remains. In this case, the representative character of the person is generally marked by dressing him or her in leaves or flowers. Sometimes, too, he is indicated by the name he or she bears. Green George in Russia. Thus, in some parts of Russia on St. George's Day, the 23rd of April, a youth is dressed out, like our Jack in the Green, with leaves and flowers. The Slovenes call him Green George. Holding a lighted torch in one hand and a pie in the other, he goes out to the cornfields, followed by girls singing appropriate songs. A circle of bush wood is then lighted, in the middle of which is set the pie. All who take part in the ceremony then sit down around the fire and divide the pie among them. In this custom, the Green George dressed in leaves and flowers is plainly identical with the similarly disguised Green George who is associated with a tree in the Carinthian, Transylvanian and Romanian customs observed on the same day. Whitsuntide customs in Russia. Again, we saw that in Russia, at Whitsuntide a birch tree is dressed in woman's clothes and set up in the house. Clearly equivalent to this is the custom observed on Whitsunday by Russian girls in the district of Pinsk. They chose the prettiest of their number, envelope her in a mass of foliage taken from the birch trees and maples, and carry her about through the village. In the district of Little Russia, they take round a poplar represented by a girl wearing bright flowers in her hair. At Whitsuntide in Holland, poor women used to go about begging with a little girl called Whitsuntide Flower. Pinkster Bloem, perhaps a kind of iris, she was decked with flowers and sat in a wagon. In North Brabant, she wears the flowers on which she takes her name, and a song is sung. Whitsuntide Flower, turn yourself once round.
May customs in France. All over Provence on the 1st of May, pretty little girls are dressed in white, decked with crowns and wreaths of roses, and sit on seats or platforms strewn with flowers in the streets, while their companions go about begging coppers for the mayos, or mays, as they are called, from the passers-by. In some parts of the Ardennes on May Day, a small girl clad in white and wearing a chaplet of flowers on her head used to go from house to house with her playmates, collecting contributions and singing that it was May, the month of May, the pretty month of May, that the wheat was tall, the hawthorn in bloom, and the lark carolling in the sky. The Little Leaf Man. In Ruha, Thuringen, as soon as the trees begin to grow green in spring, the children assemble on a Sunday and go out into the woods, where they choose one of their playmates to be the Little Leaf Man. They break branches from the trees and twine them about the child till only his shoes peep out from the leafy mantle. Holes are made in it for him to see through, and two of the children lead the Little Leaf Man that he may not stumble or fall. Singing and dancing, they take him from house to house, asking for gifts of food such as eggs, cream, sausages and cakes. Lastly, they sprinkle the Leaf Man with water and feast on the food they have collected. Leaf-clad mummers at Whitsuntide. At Rollscholzen on the Schwalm in Heath, when afternoon service is over on Whitsunday, the schoolboys and schoolgirls go out into the wood and there clothe the boy from head to foot in leaves so that nobody would know him. He is called the Little Whitsuntide Man. A procession is then formed. Two boys lead the leaf-clad playfellow, two others precede him with a basket, and two girls with another basket bring up the rear. Thus they go from house to house, singing hymns or popular songs and collecting eggs and cakes in the baskets. When they have feasted on these, they strip their comrade of his verdant envelope on an open place in front of the village. In some parts of Rhenish Bavaria, at Whitsuntide, a boy or lad is swathed in the yellow blossom of the broom, the dark green twigs of the firs, and other foliage. Thus attired he is known as the quack, and goes from door to door, whirling about in a dance, while an appropriate song is chanted and his companions levy contributions. In the Fricktal, Switzerland, at Whitsuntide, boys go out into a wood and swathe one of their number in leafy boughs. He is called the Whitsuntide Lout, Pfingstlummel, and being mounted on horseback with a green branch in his hand, he is led back into the village. At the village well, a hole is called and leaf-clad lout is dismounted and ducked in the trough. Thereby he acquires the right to sprinkling water on everybody, and he exercises the right specially on girls and street urchins. The urchins march before him in bands begging him to give them Whitsuntide wetting. Jack in the Green in England. In England, the best known example of these leaf-clad mummers is the Jack in the Green, a chimney sweeper who walks encased in a pyramidal framework of wicker-work which is covered with holly and ivy and surmounted by a crown of flowers and ribbons. Thus arrayed, he dances on May Day at the head of a troop of chimney sweeps who collect pence. The ceremony was witnessed at Cheltenham on the 2nd of May 1892 by Dr. W.H.D. Rouse, who has described in detail the costume of the performers. They were all chimney sweeps of the town.
Jack in the Green, or the bush carrier, was enclosed in a wooden framework on which leaves were fastened so as to make a thick cone about 6 feet high, topped with a crown, which consisted of 2 wooden hoops placed crosswise and covered with flowers. The leafy envelope was unbroken except for a single opening through which peered the face of the mummer. From time to time, in their progress through the streets, the performers halted, and 3 of them, dressed in red, blue and yellow respectively, tripped lightly around the leaf-clad man in the inspiring strains of a fiddle and a tin whistle on which 2 of their comrades, with blackened faces, discoursed sweet music. The leader of the procession was a clown, fantastically clad in a long white pinafore or blouse with coloured fringes and frills, and wearing on his head a beaver hat of the familiar pattern, the crown of which hung loose and was adorned with ribbons and a bird or a bundle of feathers. Large black rings surrounded his eyes, and a red dab over mouth and chin lent a pleasing variety to his countenance. He contributed to the public hilarity by flapping the yellow fringe of his blouse with quaint gestures and occasionally fanning himself languidly. His efforts were seconded by another performer who wore a red fool's cap, all stuck with flowers, and a white pinafore enriched with black human figures in front and a black gridiron-like pattern crossed diagonally by a red bar at the back. 2 boys in white pinafores with similar figures or stars on the breast and a fish on the back completed the company. Formerly there used to be a man in woman's clothes who personated the clown's wife. In some parts also of France, a young fellow was encased in a wicker framework covered with leaves and is led about. The Whitsuntide Basket in Switzerland. In Frickthal, in the Swiss canton of Aargau, a similar frame of basket work is called the Whitsuntide Basket. As soon as the trees begin to bud, a spot is chosen in the wood, and here the village lads make the frame with all secrecy, lest others should forestall them. Leafy branches are twined around 2 hoops, one of which rests on the shoulders of the weaver, the other encircles his calves. Holes are made for his eyes and mouth, and a large nosegay crowns the whole. In this guise he appears suddenly in the village at the hour of vespers, preceded by 3 boys blowing on horns made of willow bark. The great object of this abort is to set up the Whitsuntide Basket on the village well, and to keep it and him there, despite the efforts of the lads from neighbouring villages who seek to carry off Whitsuntide Basket and set it up on their own wells. The Lazy Man in Württemberg. In the neighbourhood of Oettingen, Württemberg, a masker of the same sort, known as a lazy man, Latzmann, goes about the village of Midsummer Day. He is hidden under a great pyramidal or conical frame of wickerwork 10 or 12 feet high, which is completely covered with sprigs of fir. He has a bell which he rings as he goes, and he is attended by a suit of persons dressed up in character, a footman, a colonel, a butcher, an angel, the devil, the doctor, and so on. They march in Indian file and halt before every house, where each of them speaks in character, except the lazy man who says nothing. With what they get by begging from door to door, they hold a feast. In the class of cases in which the foregoing are specimens, it is obvious that the leaf-clad person who is led about is equivalent to the May tree, May bough or May doll, which is carried from house to house by children begging. Both are representatives of the beneficent spirit of vegetation, whose visit to the house is recompensed by a present of money or food. Leaf-clad representative of vegetation is sometimes called a king or queen. Often the leaf-clad person who represents the spirit of vegetation is known as the king or the queen. Thus, for example, he or she is called the May King, Whitsuntide King, Queen of May, and so on. These titles, as Manhart observed, imply on the spirit incorporate in vegetation as a ruler whose creative power extends far and wide. May Kings of Whitsuntide in Germany and Bohemia. In a village near Swellswedel, a May tree is set up at Whitsuntide and the boys race to it. He who reaches it first is king. A garland of flowers is put round his neck, and in his hand he carries a May bush, with which, as the procession moves along, he sweeps away the dew. At each house they sing a song wishing the inmates good luck, referring to the black cow in the stall milking white milk, black hen, and the nest laying white eggs, and begging a gift of eggs, bacon, and so on. At the village of Elgoth in Silesia, a ceremony called the King's Race is observed at Whitsuntide. A pole with a cloth tied to it is set up on a meadow, and the young men ride past it on horseback, each trying to snatch away the cloth as he gallops by. The one who succeeds in carrying it off and dipping it in the neighbouring odour is proclaimed king. Here the pole is clearly a substitute for a May tree,
In some villages of Brunswick at Whitsuntide, a May King is completely enveloped in a May bush. In some parts of Thüringen also they have a May King at Whitsuntide, but he is dressed up rather differently. A frame of wood is made in which a man can stand. It is completely covered with birch boughs and is surmounted by a crown, birch and flowers in which a bell is fastened. This frame is placed in the wood and the May King gets into it. The rest go out and look for him, and when they have found him, they lead him back into the village to the magistrate, the clergyman and others, who have to guess who is in the Virtus frame. The May King. If they guess wrong, the May King rings his bell by shaking his head, and a forfeit of beer and the like must be paid by the unsuccessful guesser. At Wardstadt, in Brunswick, the boys of Whitsuntide choose by lot a king of a high steward, Fuschi Mayer. The latter is completely concealed in a May bush, wears a wooden crown wreathed with flowers, and carries a wooden sword. The king, on the other hand, is only distinguished by a nosegay in his cap and a reed with a red ribbon tied to it in his hand. They beg for eggs from house to house, threatening that, when none are given, none will be laid by the hens throughout the year. In this custom, the high steward appears, for some reason, to have usurped the insignia of the king. The Leaf King. At Hildesheim, in Hanover, 5 or 6 young fellows go about on the afternoon of White Monday, cracking long whips in measured time and collecting eggs from the houses. The chief person in the band is the Leaf King, a lad swathed so completely in birchen twigs that nothing of him can be seen but his feet. A huge headdress of birch twigs adds to his apparent stature. In his hand he carries a long crook, with which he tries to catch stray dogs and children. In some parts of Bohemia, on Whit Monday, the young fellows disguise themselves in tall caps of birch bark adorned with flowers. One of them is dressed as a king and dragged on a sledge to the village green, and if on the way they pass a pool, the sledge is always overturned into it. Arrived at the green, they gather round the king. The crier jumps on a stone or climbs up a tree and recites lampoons about each house and its inmates. Afterwards, the disguises of bark are stripped off and they go about the village on holiday attire, carrying a May tree and begging. Cakes, eggs and corn are sometimes given them. The Grass King. At Grossvargula, near Langenzaza, in the 18th century, a grass king used to be led about in procession at Whitsuntide. He was encased in a pyramid of poplar branches, on top of which was adorned with a royal crown of branches and flowers. He rode on horseback with the leafy pyramid over him, so that its lower end touched the ground, and an opening was left in it only for his face. Surrounded by a cavalcade of young fellows, he rode in procession to the town hall, the parsonage, and so on, where they all got a drink of beer. Then under the 7 lindens of the neighbouring Sommerberg, the grass king was stripped of his green casing. The crown was handed to the mayor, and the branches were stuck in the flax fields in order to make the flax grow tall. In this last trait, the fertilizing influence ascribed to the representative of the tree spirit comes out clearly. In the neighborhood of Pilsen, Bohemia, a conical hut of green branches, without any door, is erected at Whitsuntide in the midst of the village. To this hut rides a troop of village lads with a king at their head. He wears a sword at his side and a sugarloaf hat of rushes on his head. In his train are a judge, a crier, and a personage called the frog flayer or hangman. This last is a sort of ragged Merry Andrew, wearing a rusty old sword and bestriding a sorry hack. On reaching the hut, the crier dismounts and goes round it looking for a door. Finding none, he says, "Ah, this is perhaps an enchanted castle. The witches creep through the leaves and need no door." At last he draws his sword and hews his way into the hut, where there is a chair, on which he seats himself and proceeds to criticize and rhyme the girls, farmers and farm servants of the neighborhood. When this is over, the frog flayer steps forward, and after exhibiting a cage with frogs in it, sets up a gallows on which he hangs the frogs in a row. In the neighborhood of Place, the ceremony differs in some points. The king and his soldiers are completely clad in bark, adorned with flowers and ribbons. They all carry swords and ride horses, which are gay with green branches and flowers. While the village dames and girls are being criticized at the arbor, a frog is secretly pinched and poked by the crier till it quacks. Sentence of death is passed on the frog by the king. The hangman beheads it and flings the bleeding body among the spectators. Lastly, the king is driven from the hut and pursued by the soldiers. The pinching and beheading of the frog are doubtless, as Manhart observes, a rain charm. We have seen that some Indians of the Orinoco beat frogs for the express purpose of producing rain, and that killing a frog is a European rain charm.
May queens are Whitsuntide queens. Often the spirit of vegetation in spring is represented by a queen instead of a king. In the neighbourhood of Lubchowick, Bohemia, on the fourth Sunday in Lent, girls dressed in white and wearing the first spring flowers, as violets and daisies, in their hair lead about the village a girl who is called the queen and is crowned with flowers. During the procession, which is conducted with great solemnity, none of the girls may stand still, but must keep whirling round continually and singing. In every house the queen announces the arrival of spring and wishes the inmates good luck and blessings, for which she receives presents. In German Hungary, the girls choose the prettiest girl to be their Whitsuntide queen, fasten a towering wreath on her brow, and carry her singing through the streets. At every house they stop, sing old ballads and receive presents. In the southeast of Ireland on May Day, the prettiest girl used to be chosen queen of the district for 12 months. She was crowned with wildflowers, feasting, dancing, and rustic sports followed, and were closed by a grand procession in the evening. During her year of office, she presided over rural gatherings of young people at dances and merrymakings. If she married before the next May Day, her authority was at an end, but a successor was not elected till that day came round. The May Queen of Warwickshire.
The May Queen is common in France and familiar in England.
Thus, at the adjoining villages of Cherrington and Sturton in South Warwickshire, the Queen of May is still represented on May Day by a small girl dressed in white wearing a wreath of flowers on her head. An older girl wheels the Queen in what is called a mail cart, that is, a child's perambulator on two wheels. Another girl carries a money box. 4 boys bear the maypole, a conical framework formed of a high tripod with a central shaft. The whole structure is encased in a series of 5 hoops, which rise one above the other, diminishing in size from bottom to top with the tapering of the cone. The hoops, as well as the tripod and the central shaft, are all covered with whatever flowers happen to be in bloom, such as marsh marigolds, primroses, or bluebells. To the top of the central shaft is fastened a bunch of the flowers called crown imperial, if it is in season. The lowest hoop is crossed by 2 bars at right angles to each other, and the projecting ends of the bars serve as handles by which the 4 boys carry the maypole. Each of the bearers has a garland of flowers slung over his shoulder. Thus the children go from house to house singing their songs and receiving money, which goes to provide a treat for them in the afternoon. Spirit of vegetation represented simultaneously by a king and queen or a bridegroom and bride. Again, the spirit of vegetation is sometimes represented by a king and queen, a lord and lady, or a bridegroom and bride. Here again the parallelism holds between the anthropomorphic and the vegetable representation of the tree spirit, for we have seen above that trees are sometimes married to each other. At Halford in South Warwickshire, the children go from house to house on May Day, walking 2 and 2 in procession, and headed by a king and queen. 2 boys carry a maypole, some 6 or 7 feet high, which is covered with flowers and greenery. Fastened to near the top are 2 crossbars at right angles to each other. These are also decked with flowers, and from the ends of the bars hang hoops similarly adorned. At the houses the children sing May songs and receive money, which is used to provide tea for them at the schoolhouse in the afternoon. Whitsuntide King and Queen. In a Bohemian village near Koninkratz on Whit Monday, the children play the King's Game, in which a king and queen march about under a canopy, the queen wearing a garland and the youngest girl carrying 2 wreaths on a plate behind them. They are attended by boys and girls called groomsmen and bridesmaids, and they go from house to house collecting gifts. A regular feature in the proper celebration of Whitsuntide in Silesia used to be, and to some extent still is, the contest for the kingship. This contest took various forms, but the mark or goal was generally the May tree or maypole. Sometimes the youth who succeeded in climbing the smooth pole and bringing down the prize was proclaimed the Whitsuntide King and his sweetheart the Whitsuntide Bride. Afterwards the king, carrying the May bush, repaired the rest of the canopy to the alehouse, where a dance and a feast ending the merrymaking. Often the young farmers and labourers raced on horseback to the maypole, which was adorned with flowers, ribbons and a crown. He who first reached the pole was Whitsuntide King, and the rest had to obey his orders for that day. The worst rider became the clown. At the May tree all dismounted and hoisted the king on their shoulders. He nimbly swarmed up the pole and brought down the May bush and the crown, which had been fastened to the top. Meantime, the clown hurried to the alehouse and proceeded to bolt 30 rolls of bread and to swig 4-quart bottles of brandy with the utmost possible dispatch. He was followed by the king, who bore the Maybush and crown at the head of the company. If on their arrival the clown had already disposed of the rolls and the brandy, and greeted the king with a speech and a glass of beer, his score was paid by the king, otherwise he had to settle it himself. After church time, the stately procession wound through the village. At the head of it rode the king, decked with flowers and carrying the Maybush. Next came the clown with his clothes turned inside out, a great flaxen beard on his chin, and the Whitsuntide crown on his head. 2 riders disguised as guards followed. The procession drew up before every farmyard, and 2 guards dismounted, shoved the clown into the house, and claimed a contribution from the housewife to buy soap with which to wash the clown's beard. Custom allowed them to carry off any victuals which were not under lock and key. Last of all they came to the house in which the king's sweetheart lived. She was greeted as Whitsuntide Queen and received suitable presents, to wit, a many-coloured sash, a cloth, and an apron. The king got as a prize a vest and neckcloth, and so forth, and had the right of settling up the Maybush or Whitsuntide tree before his master's yard, where it remained as an honourable token to the same next day. Finally the procession took its way to the tavern, where the king and queen opened the dance. Sometimes the Whitsuntide king and queen succeeded to office in a different way. A man of straw, as large as life and crowned with a red cap, was conveyed in a cart between 2 men armed and disguised as guards to a place where a mock court was waiting to try him. A great crowd followed the cart. After formal trial, the straw man was condemned to death and fastened a stake on the execution ground. The young men with bandaged eyes tried to stab him with a spear. He who succeeded became king and his sweetheart queen. The straw man was known as the Goliath. Near Grenoble in France, a king and a queen are chosen on the 1st of May and are set on a throne for all to see. At Headington near Oxford, children used to carry garlands from door to door on May Day. Each garland was borne by 2 girls, and they were followed by a lord and lady, a boy and girl linked together by a white handkerchief, of which each held an end, and dressed with ribbons, sashes and flowers. At each door they sang a verse. Gentlemen and ladies, we wish you happy May. We come to show you a garland, because it is May Day. On receiving money, the lord put his arm about his lady's waist and kissed her. At Fleurières in Switzerland, on the 7th of May, 1843, a May bridegroom, Epox de May, and his bride were escorted in a procession of over 200 children, some of whom carried green branches of beech. A number of May fools were entrusted with the delicate duty of going round with the hat. The proceeds of their tact and industry furnished a banquet in the evening, and the day ended with a children's ball. In some Saxon villages at Whitsuntide, a lad and a lass used to disguise themselves and hide in the bushes or high grass outside the village. Then the whole village went out with music to seek the bridal pair. When they found the couple, they all gathered round them, the music struck up, and the bridal pair was led merrily to the village. In the evening they danced. In some places the bridal pair was called the prince and the princess. Whitsuntide bridegroom and bride in Denmark. In a parish of Denmark, it used to be the custom at Whitsuntide to dress up a little girl as a Whitsun bride, Pins Brunden, and a little boy as her groom. She was decked in all the finery of a grown-up bride, and wore a crown of the freshest flowers of spring on her head. Her groom was as gay as flowers, ribbons and knots could make him. The other children adorned themselves as best they could with the yellow flowers of the tulies and caltha. Then they went in great state from farmhouse to farmhouse, 2 little girls walking at the head of the procession as bridesmaids, and 6 or 8 outriders galloping ahead on hobby horses announced their coming. Contributions of eggs, butter, loaves, cream, coffee, sugar, and tallow candles were received and conveyed away in baskets. When they had made the round of the farms, some of the farmers' wives helped to arrange the wedding feast, and the children danced merrily in clogs on the stamped clay floor till the sun rose and the birds began to sing. All this is now a thing of the past. Only the old folks still remember the little Whitsun bride and her mimic pomp. Midsummer bridegroom and bride in Sweden and Norway. We have seen that in Sweden the ceremonies associated elsewhere with May Day or Whitsuntide commonly take place at midsummer. Accordingly, you'll find that in some parts of the Swedish province of Blekinge they still chose a midsummer's bride to whom the church coronet is occasionally lent. The girl selects for herself a bridegroom, and a collection is made for the pair, for who the time being are looked on as man and wife. The other youths also chose each his bride. A similar ceremony seems to be still kept up in Norway, for the correspondent writes to me as follows, in reference to the Danish custom of Whitsunday bride. It may interest you to know that on June 23, 1893, I witnessed at Alinsang, Hardanger, Norway, a ceremony almost exactly the same as I described in your book. Wildflowers are scarce there, and the bride wore the usual metal crown, the attendants for the most part wearing the pretty Hardanger costume. The dancing took place in an unlighted barn, as the farmer was afraid of fire. There were plenty of boys at the dance, but so far as I can remember, none in the procession. The custom is clearly dying out, and the somewhat reluctant bridegroom was the subject of a good deal of chaff from his fellows. In Sardinia, the midsummer couples are known as the sweethearts of St. John, and their association with the growth of plants is clearly brought out by the pots of sprouting grain which form a principal part of the ceremony. Forsaken bridegroom or bride of May Whitsuntide. In the neighbourhood of Brecon, Dauphine, on May Day, the lads wrap up in green leaves a young fellow whose sweetheart has deserted him or married another. He lies down on the ground and feigns to be asleep. Then a girl who likes him and would marry him comes and wakes him, and raising him up offers him her arm and a flag. So they go to the alehouse, where the pair lead off the dancing. But they must marry within the year, or they are treated as old bachelor and old maid, and are debarred the company of the young folk. The lad is called the bridegroom of the month of May, Le Fancy du Mois de Mai. In the alehouse he puts off his garments of leaves, out of which, mixed with flowers, his partner in the dance makes a nosegay, and wears it at her breast next day, when he leads her again to the alehouse. Like this is a Russian custom observed in the district of Nerekta on the Thursday before Whitsunday. The girls go out into a birch wood, wind a girdle or band round a stately birch, twist its lower branches into a wreath, and kiss each other in pairs through the wreath. The girls who kiss through the wreath call each other gossips. Then one of the girls steps forwards and, mimicking a drunken man, flings herself on the ground, rolls on the grass, and feigns to fall fast asleep. Another girl wakens the pretending sleeper and kisses him, and the whole bevy trips singing through the wood to twine garlands, which they throw into the water. In the fate of the garlands floating on the stream, they read their own. Here the part of the sleep was probably at one time played by a lad. In these French and Russian customs, we have a forsaken bridegroom, in the following of a second bride. On Shrove Tuesday, the Slovenes of Oberkane drag a straw puppet with joyous cries up and down the village. Then they throw it into the water or burn it, and from the height of the flames they judge of the abundance of the next harvest. The noisy crew is followed by a female masker, who drags a great hoard by a string and gives out that she is a forsaken bride. Viewed in the light of what has gone before, the awakening of the forsaken sleeper in these ceremonies probably represents the revival of vegetation in spring, but it is not easy to assign their respective parts to the forsaken bridegroom and to the girl who wakes him from his slumber. Is the sleeper the leafless forest or the bare earth of winter? Is the girl who wakes him the fresh verdure or the genial sunshine of spring? It is hardly possible, on the evidence before us, to answer these questions. The Orions of Bengal, it may be remembered, celebrate the marriage of earth in the springtime, when the sal tree is in blossom. But from this we can hardly argue that in the European ceremonies the sleeping bridegroom is the trimming earth, and the girl the spring blossoms. St. Bride in Scotland and the Isle of Man. In the Highlands of Scotland, the revival of vegetation in spring used to be graphically represented on St. Bride's Day, the 1st of February. Thus in the Hebrides, the mistress and servants of each family take a sheaf of oats and dress it up in women's apparel, put it in a large basket and lay a wooden club by it, and this they call Brid's bed. And then the mistress and servants cry 3 times, Brid is come, Brid is welcome. This they do just before going to bed, and when they rise in the morning they look among the ashes, expecting to see the impression of Brid's club there, which if they do, they reckon it a true presage of a good crop and a prosperous year. And the contrary they take as an ill omen. The same custom is described by another witness thus. Upon the night before Candlemas, it is usual to make a bed with corn and hay, over which some blankets are laid, in a part of the house near the door. When it is ready, a person goes out and repeats 3 times, Bridget, Bridget, come in, thy bed is ready. 1 or more candles are left burning near it all night. Similarly, in the Isle of Man, on the eve of the 1st of February, a festival was formerly kept called the Manx language Lao Breshi, in honour of the Irish lady who went over to the Isle of Man to receive the veil from St Morgold. The custom was to gather a bundle of green rushes, and standing with them in the hand on the threshold of the door to invite the holy St Bridget to come and lodge with them at night. In the Manx language, the invitation ran thus: Breed, breed, targais, my thee tar din, thy arms knots. Foshilgi and Doris da breed, as Elpin da breed a heat stray. In English, Bridget, Bridget, come to my house tonight. Open the door for Bridget and let Bridget come in. After these words were repeated, the rushes were strewn on the floor by way of a carpet or bed for St Bridget. A custom very similar to this was also observed in some of the out isles of the ancient kingdom of Man. In these Manx and Highland ceremonies, it is obvious that St Bride, or St Bridget, is an old heathen goddess of fertility, disguised in a threadbare Christian cloak. Probably she is no other than the Celtic goddess Bridget, who will meet us again later on. May Bride or Whitsuntide Bride. After the marriage of the spirit of vegetation in spring, though not directly represented, is implied by naming the human representative of the spirit, the bride, and dressing her in wedding attire. Thus in some villages of Altmark, a Whitsuntide, while the boys go about carrying a May tree or leading a boy enveloped in leaves and flowers, the girls lead about the May Bride, a girl dressed as a bride with a great nosegay in her hair. They go from house to house, the May Bride singing a song in which she asks for a present and tells the inmates of each house that if they give her something, they will themselves have something the whole year through. But if they give her nothing, they will themselves have nothing. In some parts of Westphalia, two girls lead a flower-crowned girl called the Whitsuntide Bride from door to door, singing a song in which they ask for eggs. At Wagham in Brunswick, when service is over on Whitsunday, the village girls assemble, dressed in white or bright colours, decked with flowers, wearing chaplets of spring flowers in their hair. One of them represents the May Bride and carries a crown of flowers on a staff as a sign of her dignity. As usual, the children go about, from cottage to cottage, singing and begging for eggs, sausages, cakes or money. In other parts of Brunswick, there's a boy clothed in all birch leaves who personates the May Bride. In Brest in the month of May, a girl called La Marielle is tricked out with ribbons and nosegays and is led about by a gallant. She is preceded by a lad carrying a green May tree, and appropriate verses are sung. End of chapter 10 and end of section 4.